It is often posited that true power does not reside in the most visible echelons of authority. Presidents, parliamentary leaders, and even pontiffs may appear to be principal figures, yet they could be perceived as participants in a much more profound historical narrative. Concealed within the annals of time are select families whose names seldom enter public discourse. These aristocrats, having exchanged their traditional crowns for control of financial institutions, have chosen secrecy over overt displays of power. They are known as the Black Nobility. One might therefore contemplate whether ancient bloodlines, some with origins tracing to Rome itself, continue to exert influence over contemporary finance, religious institutions, and political landscapes. Should this premise hold true, it would imply that modern democracy functions merely as a staged performance, its narrative orchestrated centuries prior. This perspective, while substantial, invites careful consideration. As the metaphorical curtain descends on the initial act and the immediate political spotlight dims, a more subtle narrative begins to unfold. This submerged history often communicates through quiet allusions rather than overt proclamations. The concept of influential families operating from concealed positions is not novel, persisting in both folklore and discrete discussions. Historical records themselves offer considerable basis for such conjectures. Consider, for instance, Renaissance Italy, where papal selections were frequently driven more by familial machinations than by spiritual guidance. Reflect upon Venice, where powerful merchants, often veiled by masks, shaped the destinies of empires. Observe the strategic marriages that consolidated vast fortunes across kingdoms, thereby guaranteeing the enduring prominence of names such as Orsini or Colonna. This exploration will delve into an alternative historical narrative, one often omitted from conventional academic texts. To ensure continuous access to such obscured historical insights, individuals are encouraged to engage with this content. Our journey commences in an era where the demarcation between the sacred and the profane was not an impermeable barrier, but a readily traversable curtain for those possessing sufficient wealth or lineage. The designation Black Nobility did not materialize instantaneously. It emerged from the chiaroscuro of Renaissance Italy, a world immersed in gold-leafed indulgences and clandestine coronations. While the term itself gained currency later, its foundational roots were firmly embedded in an epoch when the papal states functioned less as a spiritual dominion and more as a geopolitical chessboard. Each bishopric was a strategic square to be claimed by affluent, landed families whose bloodlines entwined around Rome with the persistence of ivy. The term times nobilta nera asterisk, or Black Nobility, was initially coined in the 19th century following the unification of Italy. It referred to specific aristocratic families who, staunchly loyal to the Pope, were divested of their privileges by the nascent secular government. These families steadfastly refused to acknowledge the authority of the newly formed Kingdom of Italy, instead clinging to papal sovereignty. However, their true history, a chronicle of power and subtle manipulation, extends much further back, long predating their classification as black. In actuality, they had never required official titles to exert control. Their influence was consistently more subtle: strategic marriages, patronage, and the careful cultivation of silence. Imagine the Roman palazzos of the 1500s, where gentlemen in exquisitely embroidered doublets debated not theological nuances, but which son would marry which niece to secure the next cardinal's hat. Consider Pope Sixtus V, whose appointments frequently aligned conspicuously with Orsini and Aldobrandini interests, or Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, whose papacy resembled a family enterprise more than a spiritual reign, with nepotism effectively codified in Latin. His daughter, Lucrezia, was strategically married off like a diplomatic dispatch, first to Giovanni Sforza, then to Alfonso of Aragon, and finally to Alfonso d'Este. Each marital alliance meticulously realigned political and financial interests. This was the nascent alchemy of the Black Nobility. a fusion of spiritual authority and dynastic ambition. The focus was not merely on who wore the mitre, but who financed the marble beneath the altar. Wealthy families such as the Chigi, Farnese, and Colonna did not merely influence the church, they permeated it, and not exclusively from the pulpit. Some occupied official ecclesiastical positions, while others simply provided financial backing. The actual locus of power frequently resided not within the Vatican's grand halls, but in drawing rooms opulent with incense and strategic discussions. An early manifestation of this fusion was the ascent of the Camerlengo, the papal chamberlain responsible for overseeing the Vatican's temporal assets. Appointees were often selected from powerful families who regarded the office as both a privilege and a lucrative investment. Managing papal revenues encompassed supervising landholdings, taxation, and diplomatic inducements. It was a role demanding utmost discretion, unwavering allegiance, and, on occasion, the ability to maintain composure while orchestrating an assassination. Yet, despite historical records detailing the economic reach of these families, a persistent ambiguity remains, a fog laden with speculation, contradictory accounts, and deliberate omissions. Did the Black Nobility actively orchestrate conclaves, ensuring their preferred candidates ascended to the throne of St. Peter? Or were they primarily opportunists, benefiting from their strategic proximity to power? One fact is unequivocally clear: they mastered the art of operating just beyond the public spotlight. Their influence was wielded with the precision of a rapier, slender, elegant, and effortlessly concealed. Modern scholars continue to debate the retrospective application of the term Black Nobility. Some contend it is a political label, retroactively applied by Vatican loyalists to portray themselves as martyrs after the loss of temporal power. Others propose that the term was weaponized during Italy's tumultuous post-unification years, when monarchists, clericalists, and republicans all contended for the narrative control of history. Still others advance a bolder claim, that the phrase was intentionally coined to obscure deeper truths, creating a category so amorphous that it could absorb all manner of allegations without ever achieving definitive clarity. Perhaps, however, that very vagueness constitutes its genius. For how does one effectively challenge a power that cannot be precisely defined? A family whose presence is noted in baptismal records, but not electoral rolls, a name appearing in papal archives solely in connection with generous donations, land grants, or the sudden emergence of an ambitious young nephew in cardinal's robes. Undoubtedly, there is an inclination to romanticize such historical narratives. Students of history are often captivated by the spectacle: the gold, the intrigue, the velvet, draped candlelight. Yet, even in its most mundane facets, the genesis of the Black Nobility hints at a form of power that most modern institutions would covet: power devoid of visibility, accountability, and term limits. After all, a monarch must eventually perish, a CEO must retire, but a family, a bloodline endures. It adapts, it awaits. As previously noted, the distinction between ecclesiastical and commercial interests became increasingly blurred in this historical trajectory. Papal authority gradually intertwined with mercantile ambitions, leading certain families to embody a dual identity, both spiritual custodians and banking dynasties. This complex duality would define many subsequent chapters. As will become evident, these early fusions extended beyond mere wealth. They fostered something far rarer: continuity, a subtle form of immortality. Therefore, as one contemplates these ancient corridors of stone and incense, it is imperative to remember the term Black Nobility did not originate as an accusation. It began as a description of unwavering loyalty, enduring lineage, and a steadfast reluctance to emerge from the shadows, even when subjected to public scrutiny. In the stillness of the night, gondolas glided silently like specters across the dark waters of Venice. Within the heart of the lagoon, lamplight flickered from the windows of the palazzi, Yet the agreements forged within those walls never reached the ears of the populace outside. Venice, a city of exquisite beauty and peculiar charm, was far more than a mere urban center. It represented an intricate experiment in controlled illusion, and in many respects, it served as the initial stage upon which the Black Nobility refined their distinctive craft. Officially, Venice was structured as a republic, devoid of a monarch or a pontiff. Power, or so the narrative maintained, was purportedly distributed. However, upon closer examination, one would discover a meticulously closed system where a select cadre of noble families orchestrated commerce, diplomacy, and warfare with the precision of master puppeteers. These families were not merely affluent, they possessed ancient lineages. Names such as Morosini, Contarini, Grimani, and Dandolo were not simply Venetian. They were, in essence, the very embodiment of Venice itself. The city's political framework was renowned for its complexity. At its core, however, resided the Great Council, an assembly that had once been open but was effectively sealed in 1297 by the time's Serrata del Maggiore, Consiglio, times the Great Council lockout. This pivotal moment transcended mere legal reform. It constituted a fundamental bloodline firewall. Subsequently, only those individuals whose ancestors had been formally registered in the council were deemed eligible to participate in governance. In essence, Venice formally codified hereditary oligarchy, transforming it from a covert practice into an enshrined law. From that point onward, newly acquired wealth could not buy entry into power, nor could foreign princes gain influence through marriage. Rule was exclusively vested in the approved families. As one mentally traverses the candlelit corridors of the Doge's palace, it is worth considering that even the Doge, the ostensible figurehead of Venice, frequently functioned as little more than a symbolic representation. He might don robes of gold, but the true wielding of power resided with the council. A well-documented instance from the early 15th century vividly illustrates the tight control exerted by these families over even the most sacred functions. When a reformer attempted to loosen the council's grip by proposing greater transparency in Venice's financial dealings with the church, the motion never even reached a vote. 2 weeks later, the individual's brother was accused of heresy, a mere coincidence, one might presume. Yet, this control extended beyond mere politics. Venice served as Europe's throbbing economic heart, the crucial intermediary between East and West. Spices, silk, silver, and even slaves flowed through its bustling ports. And who precisely owned the ships, the warehouses, and the brokerage firms? The very same noble families who meticulously controlled the council. Each successful voyage yielded not only substantial wealth, but also invaluable intelligence. In a pre-telegraphic era, information equated to power. If Genoa acquired a new fleet, if the Ottomans evinced unrest, or if a pontiff fell ill, the Venetian elite frequently possessed this knowledge before anyone else, adjusting their strategies accordingly. This intricate intertwining of mercantile and political dominance gave rise to the Venetian banking apparatus, a precursor to the formidable private financial institutions of subsequent centuries. Unlike the publicly oriented Medici of Florence, Venice's financial elite favored obscurity. Accounts were meticulously untraceable, family partnerships utilized aliases, and numerous debts owed by foreign monarchs, including the French crown, were discreetly negotiated across long tables in candlelit chambers, never announced from a public balcony. Some historians have posited that the unique structure of Venice influenced early concepts of corporate governance. Others whisper that the Black Nobility, as conceived today, originated not in Rome or London, but within these salt-stained alleys of the floating city, whose inhabitants so cherished masks that they wore them even when not formally required. A curious detail merits contemplation. Despite its immense influence, Venice famously maintained neutrality in many of Europe's most brutal conflicts. While France and Spain engaged in decades of mutual slaughter, the Venetian elite sustained trade relations with both factions. Their allegiance, as ever, was directed toward continuity and the preservation of their family's standing. Ideology was a luxury reserved for the less powerful. There exists a darker interpretation as well, though it is seldom articulated aloud in academic settings. Some researchers propose that Venetian nobles actively shaped the very conflicts they purportedly avoided, funding ships and armaments for both sides in exchange for long-term strategic leverage. If substantiated, this suggests Venice was not a passive observer of history, but an invisible co-author. Then there is the matter of the Council of Ten, a secretive body charged with safeguarding state security. On paper, it functioned as a watchdog. In reality, it constituted a pervasive network of surveillance and suppression, operating without recourse to appeal. Anonymous denunciations were encouraged, disappearances occurred, and the dungeons beneath the Doge's palace did not echo with justice, but absorbed it. And who held sway over this formidable council? Naturally, the same noble families. One scholar once wryly observed that Venice had pioneered state-sponsored paranoia centuries before George Orwell's birth. Regarding the church, the relationship was fundamentally transactional. Venice frequently clashed with the papacy, notably refusing to extradite certain clerics or remit specific taxes. Yet, even in defiance, its elite adeptly navigated the political landscape. Venetian cardinals maintained close proximity to Rome, and papal bulls frequently included curious exceptions tailored for the lagoon city. To external observers, these tensions appeared overtly political. To those intimately involved, however, they were merely standard familial disagreements, devoid of personal animosity. And should one ponder whether any of this legacy extends into modernity, consider this. Many noble Venetian families were never extinguished. They merely rebranded. Some transitioned into international finance, others into the arts and philanthropy, and some even intermarried with newer dynasties such as the Habsburgs. Their names may no longer command entry through Senate doors, but within certain exclusive private clubs, they continue to unlock other, less conspicuous gates. As noted in the preceding section, Roman palazzos fostered the early Black Nobility. Venice subsequently adopted that model, divested it of its religious intermediaries, and constructed a self-sustaining engine of generational power. Where Rome relied upon faith and ceremonial authority, Venice depended upon secrecy and trade. In both cities, nevertheless, the names behind the closed doors remained remarkably consistent. Therefore, the next time one encounters an image of masked revelers at carnival, smiling behind feathers and glitter, one might ask, what precisely are they concealing? Or, more pertinently, whom? The Vatican stands as a city of profound silences. Its majestic domes gleam beneath the sun, its basilicas resonate with prayer, and its archives extend deep underground, secured behind Latin inscriptions and layers of accumulated dust. Yet, beneath the polished marble, beneath the fragrant incense, lies something predating doctrine itself: the meticulous interweaving of bloodlines and power. If Venice served as the incubator for shadowy dynasties, then Rome provided the grand stage upon which they emerged in full regalia. And nowhere did the intricate dance of the Black Nobility achieve such perfection as in its long and intimate relationship with the papacy. It is tempting to envision popes as solitary figures, divinely appointed and guided by spiritual will. However, throughout much of history, pontiffs were elected, pressured, and even strategically acquired by families whose motivations were far more temporal than sacred. The Orsini and the Colonna, bitter rivals frequently engaged in internecine conflict, shaped centuries of church history, not through theological insight, but through calculated infiltration. They strategically placed nephews in cardinalates, arranged advantageous marriages for sisters, positioned sons within military forces, and established daughters in convents that, coincidentally, possessed land adjacent to critical trade routes. Pope Boniface VI, for example, ascended to power with Orsini backing, while Pope Martin V emerged from the Colonna clan, chosen not solely for his piety, but for political expediency. These occurrences were not anomalies. They served as foundational blueprints. The phrase cardinal nephew was not an insult. It denoted a position frequently endowed with extensive administrative authority and substantial wealth. In numerous instances, the church's upper echelons resembled a familial reunion more than a council of saints. The camerlengo, that crucial office referenced earlier, merits renewed attention here. The individual who managed the papal treasury was not merely an accountant. He was frequently a trusted member of one of the Black Nobility houses, possessing an acute understanding of both financial balance sheets and covert allegiances. During the times sede vacante asterisk, the interregnum between popes, the camerlengo wielded extraordinary control over the Vatican's finances and security. And as fate or strategic planning would often dictate, many families ensured that when the white smoke finally ascended, it signaled a candidate with an impeccably curated bloodline resume. A particularly revealing episode transpired during the 17th century papacy of Pope Clement IX. Though he presented himself as modest and intellectual, his pontificate discreetly bestowed privileges and titles upon the Chigi family, thereby solidifying their position within the Roman aristocracy. The Palazzo Chigi stands today not merely as a historical landmark, but as the official seat of the Italian Prime Minister, an irony not lost on those who trace continuity through historical corridors rather than electoral ballots. While these alignments may appear to be the stuff of operatic fiction, papal documents routinely include records of land transfers, debt forgiveness, and unique exemptions granted to specific families. The concerns were not always solely divine law. Sometimes they pertained to securing shipping rights on the Tiber or ensuring a cousin's dowry remained untaxed. Spiritual matters, yes, but also detailed financial arrangements. Some commentators have even asserted that papal conclaves themselves were perennially influenced by noble agendas. It is difficult to overlook the fact that certain families consistently produced multiple cardinals, sometimes across successive generations, forming voting blocs capable of swaying critical decisions. The secrecy of the conclave, ostensibly intended to safeguard the divine will, also served to obscure the earthly alliances forged in Roman salons in the preceding days. A curious pattern emerges when one notes the frequency with which new popes expeditiously elevated members of families that had supported their election, always, of course, with humble disclaimers of spiritual merit. The Borghese family must also be acknowledged within this intricate web. Pope Paul V, born Camillo Borghese, ascended with powerful backers and immediately initiated an aggressive campaign of familial enrichment. His relatives received extensive landholdings, new titles, and most famously, oversaw the construction of Villa Borghese, a sprawling estate more befitting a monarch than a vicar of Christ. Critics voiced their disapproval, but their whispers were unheeded. The Pope's pronouncements, after all, were divinely inspired, conveniently so. There is ongoing scholarly debate regarding the extent to which this represented genuine corruption versus the prevailing realities of governance in an era where church and state were inextricably linked. Some argue that the Black Nobility's role was exaggerated by later critics of the church, seeking to delegitimize papal authority. Others believe their influence was even more pervasive than currently understood, with recorded instances representing only what could not be concealed. A recurrent question pertains to whether these families genuinely believed in the church's mission, or merely utilized it as a pragmatic vehicle for dynastic expansion. The truth, as often is the case, likely encompasses both. A family such as the Aldobrandini might sponsor religious art and fund missions to the New World, while simultaneously manipulating conclaves to ensure a favorable outcome. Altruism and ambition were not mutually exclusive. They were siblings nurtured under the same frescoed ceilings. This amalgamation of sacred and hereditary power reaches a chilling apex when considering the staffing of papal armies. Many commanders were noble relatives. Numerous campaigns, such as those during the 16th century papal wars, were waged not for matters of faith, but for territorial gain, and the prestige of the families poised to benefit. The Vatican minted coins, signed treaties, and levied troops precisely like any sovereign state. The mitre may have shimmered in candlelight, but the hands beneath it bore signet rings, not stigmata. As observed in Venice, certain noble families adeptly transformed commerce into a form of governance. In Rome, the Black Nobility inverted this formula. Here, governance, particularly spiritual governance, became the framework for dynastic preservation. Where Venice perfected anonymity, Rome perfected visibility without accountability. To the faithful, these figures were esteemed patrons. To the initiated, they were astute architects. Therefore, the next time one enters a chapel and beholds a lavish tomb inscribed with a cardinal's name, sculpted in white marble with gilded letters, one might consider, was he truly a servant of God or of his family? A discernible shift emerges, marked not by military engagements or coronations, but by ledgers and signatures. The ancient families who once commanded armies and wore jeweled crowns gradually exchanged their swords for seals, their thrones for office chairs in counting rooms. Yet, this should not be interpreted as a decline into irrelevance. On the contrary, they adapted with elegance and ruthlessness. The Black Nobility comprehended that power was not necessarily lost when monarchies fell. It was simply rebranded. As monarchical systems across Europe began to destabilize in the 18th and 19th centuries, aristocratic houses confronted a critical dilemma. Feudal privileges were being challenged, revolutions brewed, and the traditional codes of allegiance no longer guaranteed survival. Consequently, many turned to the one institution that appeared impervious to public upheaval: finance. One can, after all, guillotine a duke, but one cannot guillotine a bank account domiciled in Liechtenstein. What commenced as cautious investment rapidly evolved into a profound transformation. The very families who had once governed provinces began to establish private banks or discreetly acquire stakes in established financial institutions. They purchased shares in shipping companies, mines, and railroads, executing these acquisitions with quiet deliberation. Titles diminished in importance compared to access. The era of the conspicuous baron was receding. In his place rose the silent shareholder. A particularly striking illustration is the Torlonia family. Initially minor nobles, they amassed immense wealth in the 18th century as papal bankers. Their financial influence became so substantial that they acquired titles, vast landholdings, and ultimately inscribed their name among Rome's elite. Their ascent was achieved not on battlefields but through mastering debt management, strategic estate purchases, and high-stakes loans, including those extended to the Vatican itself. When Pope Pius VII required assistance managing papal revenues during Napoleon's occupation, it was a Torlonia, not a cardinal, who stepped forward. Here, one observes how the Church, frequently regarded in purely spiritual terms, served as a gateway to considerable material influence. Families once intimately linked with religious authority repurposed that proximity into significant capital leverage. The Black Nobility did not merely survive political upheavals, they engineered new positions for themselves within emerging systems. Their clandestine understanding that paper, whether in the form of bonds, marriage, contracts, or confidential trusts, possessed greater enduring strength than iron proved prescient. It was during this period that the transition became generational. Heirs were no longer exclusively dispatched to military academies or ecclesiastical schools. They were sent to Oxford, Geneva, and Vienna to acquire proficiency in the language of credit and cash flow. A Colonna heir might now be found managing a portfolio of international infrastructure holdings, while a Borghese descendant might occupy a position on the board of a multinational insurance firm. Public knowledge of these connections was unnecessary, as these positions were discreetly embedded within shell companies, proxies, and trust funds older than some contemporary nations. A fascinating debate persists among economic historians regarding whether these families influenced the creation of the modern banking secrecy model. Some argue that Swiss financial discretion owes its origins to aristocratic demands for anonymity in asset transfers during revolutionary periods. Others point to Luxembourg or Monaco as havens subtly shaped by noble preferences for privacy. Whether thoroughly documented or merely whispered, the outcome remains consistent. Financial systems evolved to accommodate those who prioritized invisibility. It is pertinent to note how this contrasts with the behavior of time's nouveau riche asterisk. New money often flaunts its acquisitions. Old money meticulously conceals them. While industrial magnates might construct towering skyscrapers emblazoned with their names, the Black Nobility favored foundations, discreet donations, and untraceable holdings. They learned to navigate the world without triggering public alarm, a form of ghost aristocracy immune to the spotlight, yet omnipresent in its influence. Furthermore, there is the intriguing pattern of post-monarchical roles. In the 20th century, as constitutional monarchies diminished in power and noble titles lost their legal efficacy, many descendants were quietly integrated into banking, diplomacy, and supranational institutions. A former Roman prince might find himself managing international real estate portfolios. A Venetian patrician lineage might direct its attention to cultural foundations endowed with vast sums. No longer rulers by decree, they became curators of capital, and capital, as ever, recognizes no national flag. Skeptics, of course, exist. Some historians assert that the influence of these families is overstated, positing that their transition to finance was no different from any wealthy landowner adapting to modernity. However, such assessments often overlook the ancient, durable, and remarkably patient networks that span generations. When one's cousin marries into a German banking dynasty and one's niece heads a discreet Geneva holding company, influence becomes a matter of intricate architecture, not overt authority. As previously explored, Venice exemplified the art of continuity through commerce. Here, Rome's noble houses adopted a similar strategy, but with a nuanced twist. They embedded themselves within the very systems that superseded them. In doing so, they not only survived the demise of feudalism, but effectively financed its eulogy. A particularly obscure yet telling example lies in the fate of the Barberini family. Their Baroque palaces and papal connections were renowned, but by the 20th century, they had transformed their holdings into strategic real estate investments across Europe. Some were held directly, others channeled through family-run trusts in neutral countries. Today, their assets are challenging to trace, not because they have vanished, but because they have been transmuted into financial instruments that few are equipped to monitor. This leads to a persistent, hotly debated question. Are we witnessing the remnants of fading privilege, or the sophisticated blueprint of enduring dominance? Are these noble financiers merely affluent relics, or are they the architects of a new world order, one where hereditary influence is maintained not through banners and armies, but through equity and offshore legal frameworks? The answer, as always, lies within the details. And the details, as is becoming apparent, are seldom found in conventional textbooks. They are whispered in footnotes, interred in archives, or occasionally glimpsed when a 4-generations-old trust fund discreetly acquires controlling shares in a media conglomerate. Therefore, the next time one passes a bank named for a region, a saint, or a neutrally sounding firm in Zurich, one might consider who ultimately owns it. Not merely the edifice, not solely the brand, but the legacy and perhaps, just perhaps, the future. In Renaissance Europe, a marriage was seldom primarily about romantic love. It was a strategic maneuver, a sealed agreement in silk and lace. The bride carried more than a dowry. She carried a treaty, a bridge between bloodlines, a rebalancing of empires measured not by emotion but by inheritance. For the Black Nobility, matrimony was not a ceremony, it was policy. One can almost visualize it. Candlelight flickering over polished walnut tables where two patriarchs quietly confer over terms. The bride, frequently 14 or 15 years of age, waits in an adjacent chamber. She has no need to comprehend that this union will determine whether her father's cousin attains the next cardinal's hat. She simply understands she will journey to another city, another palazzo. The linens are already embroidered. Among the Roman elite, this practice evolved into an art form. Families such as the Orsini, Chigi, and Colonna arranged marriages with clinical precision. A daughter might be betrothed to a lesser noble in Florence to gain access to Medici banking networks. A son might be offered to a Venetian patrician's widow, older, certainly, but wealthy and childless. Titles were exchanged like heirlooms, dowries weighed against strategic value, and consistently, the church stood ready to sanctify the union or annul it, depending on who offered greater inducement. This was not a novel practice, of course. Royal families had always engaged in strategic marriages. However, the Black Nobility elevated this practice into a multi-generational chess game. Their objective was not merely alliance, it was absorption. Bloodlines were merged, rebranded, and occasionally discreetly eradicated. One obscure example involves the Lante della Rovere family, who began as lesser-known Umbrian nobility, but married into the even older della Rovere line, which had once held papal prominence under Julius II. This union resurrected the older name and restored access to long-forgotten privileges, all without the necessity of military engagement. Marriage enabled these families to transcend national boundaries. By the 18th century, Roman nobles were intermarrying with Austrian Habsburg cadet branches, French ducal houses, and even Bavarian industrial families. The old-world papal aristocracy began to fuse with the emerging bourgeois elite of the Enlightenment. Old money met new, and from this amalgamation arose something more potent than either individually: capital reinforced by ancient legitimacy. This intermingling extended beyond mere economics, encompassing significant legal implications. Certain marriage contracts included clauses granting exclusive rights to inherit land or ecclesiastical appointments. Others subjected future generations to the influence of canon law, thereby binding them to Vatican jurisdiction. By the time a descendant inherited a title or estate, they were often beholden to an intricate web of ancestral agreements, most of which bore Rome's sanction. There is a particular anecdote, rarely recounted in official histories, concerning a 19th century union between a Borghese and the son of a Bavarian industrialist. Superficially, it appeared to be a charming cultural exchange, Italian Baroque romance meeting German precision. However, the dowry included not only gold and artistic works, but also rights to an obscure trust fund linked to papal landholdings in southern Lazio. 2 generations later, that trust discreetly financed a series of real estate acquisitions across Munich and Vienna. The connection, buried in a footnote, the name omitted from public filings, remained largely unnoticed. As previously discussed, noble families adeptly adapted to evolving systems, from monarchical rule to financial institutions. Marriage served as the crucial bridge between these disparate worlds, ensuring that irrespective of a regime's ascent or collapse, the family remained deeply embedded. Kings could be overthrown, governments replaced. But a marriage contract filed under canon law that endures, sometimes for centuries, safely preserved in the Vatican archives. The practice was not without controversy. Even within noble circles, some regarded these unions as excessively transactional, devoid of genuine affection. A few families disastrously attempted to marry for sentiment. One Venetian heir, captivated by an opera singer, rejected his father's proposed match to a Roman duchess. He was disinherited within the year. The opera singer, as it transpired, was already married. The estate, meanwhile, passed to a more compliant cousin who promptly married into the Orsini line, thereby doubling the family's political reach. A persistent, scholarly debate centers on the extent to which these marriages influenced church policy. Could a strategically arranged marriage secure a favorable interpretation of canon law? Did familial alliances sway papal bulls? Some argue affirmatively, while others contend the connections were too abstract to wield significant impact. Yet, the pattern endures. Nobles marry, titles are exchanged, and policies, subtly shift a few months later. Coincidence or deliberate design? The Vatican's silence, as always, is profoundly eloquent. Nevertheless, even within this intricate web of strategy, moments of unexpected tenderness occasionally surfaced. Letters survive, hidden in family archives, wherein young brides penned their fears, hopes, and confusion in shaky Latin. Some evolved into formidable figures in their own right. One Colonna duchess managed vast estates, corresponded with cardinals, and financed a Jesuit college, all while raising 11 children. Her legacy remains largely relegated to footnotes, yet the college still bears her initials in its foundation stone. So often, history is perceived as a chronicle of battles and speeches, flags and declarations. Yet, sometimes, it is embodied in a pair of rings, exchanged in a candlelit chapel, a signature on parchment, a whispered promise in a language neither party speaks fluently. These are the moments that fundamentally reshaped dynasties. A pertinent reflection to carry forward when examining modern political marriages between media dynasties, financial firms, or even philanthropic foundations is to seek echoes of these historical patterns. Consider whether a press release announcing a charitable trust might represent the contemporary equivalent of a 17th century dowry clause. Consider whether the merging of two non-profit boards might be less about shared values and more about intertwined bloodlines, however metaphorical. In this historical context, marriage is not merely about joining hands. It is about closing loops, completing circuits of influence that commenced generations prior. And for the Black Nobility, it was, and perhaps still is, the most elegant method of conquest. No siege required, merely a cathedral, a signature, and a very expensive confection. The cobblestone streets of Rome resonate with the weight of centuries, each stone a silent witness to secrets etched into its enduring fabric. Yet, beyond the ivy-clad walls and palatial gates, something even more persistent endures: the names. Not the Caesars or emperors carved into marble, but the familial names that somehow defy disappearance. Orsini, Colonna, Borghese, Chigi. These are not mere relics, they are survivors. And, according to some perspectives, they remain active participants. The Orsini name has long been synonymous with power not solely ecclesiastical, but military, economic, and territorial. They were princes, cardinals, and condottieri. One branch of the family governed portions of southern Italy with sufficient autonomy to rival established monarchies. Their alliances were extensive, as were their long-standing feuds. The Orsini engaged in centuries of conflict with the Colonna, their rivalry becoming a defining feature of Rome's political theatre. Their palazzi still stand, not as ruins, but as properties managed by legal trusts, leased, or curated by foundations bearing the same ancient crest. The Colonna, for their part, were equally entrenched. The family traces its lineage back to the 10th century, though their true ascent began when Odon Colonna was elected Pope Martin V in 1417, initiating an era of familial ascendancy within the Vatican. Their estates sprawled across Lazio, and their portraits adorned noble galleries throughout Europe. Despite enduring political defeats, exiles, and confiscations, they consistently returned. Like ivy, they rerouted in any available crevice. As noted earlier, certain families mastered resilience by embracing enduring mechanisms rather than clinging to visible thrones. The Colonna epitomized this strategy. In the 20th century, a family member served as mayor of Rome. Another worked discreetly within the foreign ministry, while others maintained a much lower profile, managing art collections, libraries, and even vineyards. Their influence was no longer overt, it was ambient. Then there is the Borghese family, arguably the most flamboyant of the Black Nobility. Their rise was meteoric. Camillo Borghese became Pope Paul V in 1605 and immediately embarked on a campaign of dynastic aggrandizement. Nephews were appointed cardinals, vast estates were acquired, and the Villa Borghese, now a public museum, once served as their private showcase, filled with masterpieces by Bernini and Caravaggio, and imbued with scandalous whispers. Yet, even as the Papal States collapsed and Rome transitioned into the Kingdom of Italy, the Borghese did not vanish. They pivoted. One Borghese prince married Napoleon's sister. Others turned to diplomacy, banking, and even motor racing. The family crest, with its dragon and eagle, still adorns buildings in Rome and high-end wine bottles on distant shelves. The Chigi family presents a different narrative, quieter, more surgical. Their legacy is directly linked to papal banking. Agostino Chigi, the Renaissance-era magnate, known as Il Magnifico, financed popes and commissioned artists such as Raphael. He constructed the Villa Farnesina, where even the ceilings seemed to whisper of influence. Later, the Chigi family intermarried with the Albani line, becoming stewards of political balance in Rome through both ecclesiastical and diplomatic channels. The Palazzo Chigi, their urban palace, now functions as the seat of Italy's prime minister, an ironic twist that maintains the building in perpetual proximity to power. Yet, for all their historical visibility, these families mastered the art of partial disappearance. Their names endure, though rarely in headlines. Instead, one finds them in footnotes, on foundation boards, within minor embassies, or linked to obscure real estate holdings. A Colonna daughter might chair a cultural trust. A Borghese heir might curate Renaissance archives. A Chigi descendant might own one of Italy's oldest libraries. None of them seek public office. They have no need to. A persistent rumor circulates in academic circles that these families coordinate not through formal councils, but through long-standing tradition. An invitation, only dinner here. A private mass there. Events where attendance is more hereditary than scheduled. While no documents explicitly confirm such assemblies, certain Vatican clerics have hinted that some families are granted consultative access on matters of cultural heritage, land rights, or ecclesiastical appointments. This is not explicit policy, it is sustained continuity. A recent scholarly debate queries whether the Black Nobility still functions as a unified bloc. One side argues that the concept is romanticized, that modern wealth and politics have eroded the unique influence of aristocracy. The opposing view asserts that these families have simply refined their methods, embedding themselves in institutions that shape global culture rather than overt policy. The truth, as often is the case, is likely situated between these perspectives, or perhaps concealed behind a fresco. One might inquire if princes still walk the streets of Rome. Technically, yes. While Italy legally abolished noble titles, many are still socially recognized, particularly among older elites and foreign dignitaries. A Colonna prince might own a wedding venue. A Borghese might serve as honorary president of a historical society. Titles hold little legal sway in contemporary courtrooms, but retain considerable cachet in certain exclusive salons. It is also pertinent to consider these families' relationship with wealth today. They are not oligarchs in the modern sense. They rarely appear on Forbes lists. However, they maintain their wealth in discrete, structured forms: land, art, foundations, and private portfolios. A Chigi-owned vineyard might produce award-winning wine under a corporate name. A Borghese art collection might be on permanent loan to the Vatican, which is, of course, tax-deductible. What truly binds these families together is not ideology, but memory. They recall their historical prominence, and through meticulous archives, family records, portraits, and oral tradition, they ensure that future generations do so as well. This is not mere vanity, it is a profound strategy. A name truly fades only when it is no longer spoken, and these families ensure theirs are whispered in precisely the right ears. Therefore, the next time one strolls through Rome and observes a stone plaque inscribed with a half-recognized name, one might pause. That courtyard one is passing might not merely be a tourist attraction. It might be a cornerstone of a dynasty that never truly fell, but merely changed its attire. In certain Roman circles, a saying is whispered: if the Black Nobility is the body, the Jesuits are the nervous system. This peculiar metaphor is nonetheless a For when the noble families required more than mere gold, more than mere bloodlines, when they sought extended reach, they turned to the one institution that even monarchs held in awe: the Society of Jesus, formidable, intellectual, and fiercely loyal. The enduring question, however, has always been, loyal to whom? Founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuits were never an ordinary religious order. From their inception, they were soldiers of the Church, certainly, but armed with rhetoric, logic, and education as much as any sword. Their mission was global. Their method, strategic infiltration through universities, confessionals, and royal courts. Within a century, they had advisors in royal chambers, missionaries in China, and teachers in every elite academy from Paris to Prague. And often, discreetly at their side, stood noble benefactors, men and women who understood that the society's vows of poverty did not preclude influence, they merely veiled it in piety. The relationship between the Jesuits and Rome's noble houses commenced as patronage. Wealthy families, the Farnese, the Borghese, even the Chigi, financed Jesuit schools and churches, donated land, and arranged lucrative appointments. Initially, this appeared mutually beneficial. The nobles gained spiritual prestige, and the Jesuits achieved expansion. Over time, however, the lines blurred. Jesuit confessors heard secrets from behind silk curtains. Jesuit professors shaped the minds of young noble sons, and Jesuit economists, yes, they possessed those advised on the ethics of interest and taxation, often justifying positions that best served their patrons. As previously explored, families such as the Colonna and Orsini exerted influence through bloodlines and inheritance. The Jesuits, however, offered something even more invaluable: narrative control. In the hands of a skilled Jesuit, a family's ambition could be reframed as divine duty, a land acquisition as responsible stewardship, a politically motivated marriage as a sacred sacrament. The Black Nobility did not merely fund the society, they collaborated with it to shape the ideological contours of Europe. One renowned, or perhaps infamous figure, was Cardinal Roberto Bellarmino, a Jesuit theologian who also served as a confidant to powerful Roman nobles. His writings were referenced in both heresy trials and political negotiations. Bellarmino's work exemplifies the dual nature of Jesuit power, profoundly theological, yet supremely diplomatic. When he was not engaged in debates with Galileo, he was drafting correspondence to princes. The Jesuits possessed the acumen to formulate a papal bull in a manner that satisfied both canon law and the estate plans of an amenable marquis. However, the connection was not always harmonious. Tensions erupted in the 18th century as the Jesuits became excessively independent, too effective. Monarchs, apprehensive of their growing influence, expelled them from France, Spain, and Portugal. Even the Pope, under immense pressure, suppressed the order in 1773. Yet, during those wilderness years, many Jesuits found refuge not in monasteries but within noble estates. Black nobility families offered them sanctuary, support, and, according to some accounts, discreet channels to continue their work. A debated case involves the Torlonia family, who rose to prominence during the suppression period. While no formal record of direct Jesuit ties exists, estate logs from the time show regular deliveries to known Jesuit scholars and payments to educational advisors with Jesuit training. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps the suppression was merely cosmetic, the partnership simply moving underground. The Jesuits were restored in 1814, and the partnership resumed, though with greater subtlety. The focus now shifted to education and global reach. Noble families helped fund Jesuit missions abroad, particularly in Asia and South America. These were not solely acts of charity, they were strategic investments. A Jesuit school in Brazil represented a foothold in colonial trade. A Jesuit university in the Philippines signified future political connections influenced by proxy. One obscure yet illuminating example concerns the Massimo family, an ancient Roman house with documented support for Jesuit institutions. In the early 20th century, A Massimo heir chaired the board of a Jesuit-founded publishing house. Another served on the advisory council for a university curriculum committee. Through these roles, the family helped shape public messaging, curate acceptable ideologies, and, it is whispered, suppressed lines of inquiry deemed inconvenient. This leads to a broader question, still hotly debated in modern ecclesiastical circles. Were the Jesuits merely instruments of noble patrons? Or did they evolve into something more, a partner, an equal, a force capable of not only reinforcing aristocratic power but subtly directing it? One historian proposed the concept of dual allegiance. The Jesuits, while loyal to Rome, were also bound through long-standing favor and shared history to the Black Nobility. Conflicts of interest were inevitable but also meticulously managed. Jesuits are rigorously trained to weigh complex moral arguments. Perhaps balancing spiritual integrity against dynastic loyalty was simply another such exercise. As discussed in the context of marriage strategy, canon law provided an enduring legal framework. The Jesuits too operated within that sphere, advising on dispensations, inheritances, exemptions, and vows. A Jesuit confessor to a noblewoman might discern that her cousin was plotting to divert an estate's income. A Jesuit-trained lawyer might assist in preventing it. Influence was rarely linear. It pulsed outward, through trusted channels, soft, invisible, yet enduring. Even today, the ties persist. Several prominent Italian families maintain private chapels with Jesuit affiliations. Donations continue to flow, not always substantial, but consistent. And Jesuit-run schools remain magnets for the elite. A modern-day Orsini descendant is more likely to sit on a Jesuit university's board than in parliament, and this is by design. Therefore, one might ask, in a world obsessed with overt visibility, who truly wields greater power? The politician who delivers speeches, or the advisor who crafts the speech? The banker prominently featured on the cover of Forbes, or the ethics professor who instructed him on how to frame a tax shelter as social responsibility? The Jesuits, much like the Black Nobility, rarely caught public attention. They have no need to. Their power resides not in the spotlight, but within the script. And somewhere, behind an oak desk in a quiet Roman villa, another meeting unfolds. A Jesuit priest, a noble heir, a whispered discussion about the next generation. It commences anew, not with a war, but with a signature, a quiet transaction, a ledger meticulously balanced behind a velvet curtain. The age of crusades and coronets was receding, yielding its place to something far more enduring: numbers. For the Black Nobility, this represented not a retreat from influence, but a strategic advancement. Why risk one's title on the battlefield when control could be exerted from within a vault? By the dawn of the modern era, Europe's noble families had begun to master a distinct form of power: financial capital. Their entry into banking, however, was not sudden. It was a slow, calculated evolution rooted in centuries of land management, tax farming, and church-backed credit systems. The transition from managing tithes to issuing loans was not a grand leap. Once this transition was made, the foundations of private banking empires quietly took shape, some of which persist to this day. The Torlonia family, as previously mentioned, exemplifies this transition. Their ascent as papal bankers stands as one of the clearest illustrations. By lending substantial sums to the Vatican during the Napoleonic era, they secured not merely repayment, but social elevation. Titles followed wealth, as did real estate. What began as a series of loans culminated in the family possessing multiple Roman palazzos and being granted princely status. Torlonia was no longer merely a surname, it was a financial dynasty, and they were not alone. The Aldobrandini family, long associated with ecclesiastical offices, gradually positioned itself within real estate and banking networks connected to the Holy See. The Pallavicini, once a Genoese noble clan, extended their reach through strategic investments across Austria and northern Italy. Even the Doria Pamphilj family, more renowned for its extensive art collection, discreetly held shares in early investment houses and colonial trading firms. These families understood what many monarchs failed to grasp. Political power may wane, but debt endures. A noble could be exiled, but a creditor is invariably invited back to the negotiating table. The Medici, of course, represent a famous precedent. While not traditionally categorized among the Black Nobility, their model of leveraging financial acumen to infiltrate the church and intermarry with royalty became a template. What distinguishes the Black Nobility is their discretion. Whereas the Medici became synonymous with Renaissance power, these families favored anonymity. Their names were not emblazoned on banks. They were embedded within trusts, foundations, and shell companies bearing innocuous names such as Sanctum Holdings or Europa Investimenti. A fascinating pattern emerges when examining 19th century banking records. Private institutions based in Rome, Venice, Vienna, and Paris frequently received startup capital or board-level participation from aristocratic lineages that, just decades prior, had been reduced to ceremonial status. The nobility had not vanished. They had simply reallocated their portfolios. One little-known detail, the Chigi family, already deeply entrenched in papal history, maintained controlling interest in a financial firm linked to agricultural export contracts throughout the Italian unification period. As regions rebelled and borders shifted, grain prices rose, and the Chigi discreetly profited. They were not drafting treaties, they were drafting contracts. This raises an ongoing scholarly debate. To what extent did noble banking empires shape the macroeconomic development of modern Europe? Did they merely invest, or did they actively steer? Evidence suggests their role was not passive. In several instances, their lending choices influenced diplomatic outcomes. A papal loan delayed until a favorable election. A trade credit extended precisely as a key marriage alliance was finalized. Coincidence? Possibly, but when the same surnames appear in both financial ledgers and baptismal registries, patterns inevitably emerge. The Jesuit connection, as traced in the previous chapter, also played a significant role here. Jesuit economists assisted in formulating moral arguments in favor of interest-bearing loans. Once considered taboo by canon law, these arguments, adopted by church authorities, paved the way for Catholic financial institutions to operate with greater latitude. And who was poised, checkbook in hand? The noble families who had already established deep ties within both the church and commercial markets. Consider the example of the Rothschilds. Often portrayed as Europe's preeminent banking family, they were, at times, discreetly guided or even eclipsed by older noble houses. Some researchers suggest that in certain Vatican dealings, noble intermediaries acted as filters or partners, ensuring that funds flowed through approved channels. These intermediaries were not employees. They were families with coats of arms and centuries of archival leverage. This is where we must briefly revisit Venice. Recall how its oligarchs preferred silence over spectacle. The same principle applied here. Noble banks rarely disclosed their holdings. Many existed as discreet family offices known only to select clients and cardinals. When public banks emerged, noble financiers frequently retained hidden stakes. Some even contributed to designing regulatory structures that safeguarded ancestral wealth while limiting access for competitors. It is a subtle maneuver. Formulate the rules, then withdraw from public view. Even today, remnants of these dynasties remain embedded within financial systems. A trust in Liechtenstein, originally established in 1912, traces its origins to an Orsini land liquidation. A foundation in Switzerland manages environmental philanthropy, yet its board includes a Massimo descendant and a former Jesuit treasurer. These entities do not publicly advertise their lineage, but they have no need to. The influence resides not in the logo, but in the continuity. So, what is the unresolved question here? It pertains to the extent of modern influence. Are these families still active players in today's financial landscape, or merely custodians of diminishing fortunes? Some argue they are quaint relics. Others point to enduring ties in real estate, boutique finance, and international arbitration. In either case, one fact is clear. The transition from throne to bank did not diminish the power of the Black Nobility. It refined it, codified it, and in certain respects, rendered it more difficult to trace. A monarch's power ends at a national border. A bank's power, however, is an entirely different matter. It commenced with maritime vessels, exotic spices, and subtle ambition. Venice, a master of veiled power and mercantile shrewdness, had for centuries governed the vital arteries of Mediterranean trade. Yet, as empires shifted and new oceans beckoned, the floating city perceived the impending conclusion of its era. The locus of true power was gradually migrating westward. Consequently, like any seasoned operator, the families who had dominated Venice's Great Council began a strategic repositioning, not through military might, but through capital. Their gaze turned toward London. By the 17th and 18th centuries, England was emerging as the new epicenter of global commerce. The East India Company's influence was rapidly expanding. Maritime insurance markets were forming in London's coffeehouses, and a novel form of empire, one built not on faith but on finance, was taking shape. It was not lost on the Venetian patriciate that this represented the future, and discreetly, strategically, they began to integrate themselves into it. This was not a mass migration. There were no galleys transporting noble families across the Channel. It was a more subtle process. A younger son dispatched to study law at Oxford, a daughter married to the cousin of a rising merchant banker, a silent partnership in a textile firm, importing raw cotton from India. The shift transpired over decades, a gradual seeding of influence carried by both bloodline and financial acumen. One particularly fascinating case involves the Contarini family. Once powerful electors in the Venetian Republic, their wealth diminished as trade routes bypassed the Adriatic, yet their financial instincts remained acute. Records from the 1722 indicate a Contarini heir marrying into an English merchant banking family based in Bristol. Their descendants would subsequently appear in the founding charters of early insurance firms, and one, curiously, served on a committee reviewing trade regulations during the Napoleonic Wars. Their Venetian origin is scarcely noted, yet in the family's coat of arms, the unmistakable winged lion of Street Mark serves as a subtle clue. The connection between Venetian and British interests deepened through shared values, discretion, control through commerce, and an aversion to overt governance. Both traditions favored influence without visibility, and both understood the strategic power of debt. The Venetian families, already proficient in sophisticated credit systems, found a familiar language in England's nascent financial institutions, a language they could speak fluently. Enter the Bank of England, established in 1694. While by no means a Venetian creation, its core principles centralizing national debt, managing currency, influencing wartime finance, would have been readily comprehensible to any 15th century Venetian banker. Some suggest, with cautious footnotes, that early investors included intermediaries linked to Italian banking houses with noble Venetian ancestry. The records are ambiguous, the names obscured by Latinized spellings and transnational marriages, but the financial fingerprints persist. As previously discussed, Venice's elite preferred masks. In London, they discovered a different form of disguise, the corporation. British law allowed for limited liability companies, offshore registries, and an intricate web of financial instruments. For families accustomed to behind-the-scenes governance, this was an ideal operational environment. They could own, manage, and direct, all while remaining shielded from public view. By the late 18th century, London had evolved not merely into a financial center, but a magnet for old continental wealth seeking revitalization. Austrian, French, and indeed, Italian noble lineages began establishing holding companies, discreet trusts, and philanthropic fronts within the city. Some operated from Mayfair townhouses, others functioned through legal proxies in the City of London, a square mile where titles held less sway than capital. A minor but telling detail, Several churches in central London display plaques bearing surnames one might expect to encounter in Florence or Venice, rather than Westminster. Donations were made, choirs funded, scholarships endowed, all seemingly minor gestures, yet subtle signals. The families were establishing roots, not ostentatiously, not with fanfare, but persistently. This raises a central scholarly debate. Was this migration intentional, a coordinated strategic pivot, or merely a coincidence of shared financial evolution? Skeptics argue that the Venetian connection to London is overstated, a fabrication of genealogists. However, others point to undeniable patterns. Families with ties to the Venetian Republic emerging generations later as significant stakeholders in London's merchant banks, insurers, and shipping consortia. The Rothschilds, often regarded as the archetypal European banking dynasty, are sometimes misconstrued in this narrative. While they dominated 19th century finance, certain records suggest that older noble families, those operating with greater discretion, acted as facilitators. The Rothschilds possessed liquidity, but the Black Nobility held something rarer: embedded trust networks spanning centuries. A whispered endorsement from a Roman prince might open doors that money alone could not. It is also crucial to consider the matter of marriage, or rather, the lack thereof. While the Rothschilds famously practiced endogamy to preserve wealth and heritage, they were largely excluded from intermarriage with Catholic nobility. The Black Nobility, already intricately interwoven with Habsburgs, Bourbons, and other papal-aligned houses, rarely admitted new blood. Exceptions occurred, certainly, but they were infrequent and typically ceremonial. The unspoken social message was clear: admiration did not equate to acceptance. This tacit barrier persisted into the 20th century. Even as Rothschild institutions expanded their reach, they frequently did so alongside, not through, the older, noble banking houses. In Zurich, for instance, Rothschild representatives collaborated with trust firms long rumored to be controlled by descendants of the Doria or Massimo lines. These were not partnerships of equals, but of convenience. And consistently, the noble names remained absent from the public masthead. This fuels an ongoing debate among modern historians. Did the Black Nobility merely coexist with the Rothschilds, or did they quietly direct them? Were the Rothschilds the public face, while the families of Rome and Venice remained the hand behind the curtain? Some contend this is fanciful, asserting that the Rothschilds operated independently, driven by Enlightenment, rationalism, and capitalism, not by old-world alliances. Others suggest that the Black Nobility, understanding the escalating reach of anti-Semitic rhetoric, allowed the Rothschilds to absorb blame and scrutiny that would otherwise have fallen upon Catholic aristocrats, an elegant and plausible deflection. One might have already observed this recurring pattern. The same families, employing similar tactics, embedded anonymity, strategic marriages, discreet trusts, and long-term memory. The Rothschilds captivated the world. The Black Nobility observed from their salons, adjusted their holdings, and ensured that the overarching narrative remained indistinct. Therefore, the next time someone suggests that the Rothschilds governed the world, one might pause. Consider who benefits from such a belief. Consider who remains unmentioned. Consider who never speaks, and never has to. The Alps have historically served as a formidable guardian, protecting the lands within their embrace. Armies would pause at their base. Empires hesitate at their jagged ridgelines. Switzerland, nestled amidst these mountains, cultivated its unique geography into a philosophical stance: neutrality, discretion, and silence. However, silence, as the Black Nobility well understood, can be a potent form of strategy. And in Switzerland, that strategy evolved into sanctuary. By the late 19th century, as monarchies continued their decline and political volatility became the norm, certain noble families began to regard Switzerland not merely as a travel destination or a summer retreat, but as a secure repository for their very legacy. Unlike London, which offered instruments of influence, or Rome, which provided the weight of tradition, Switzerland offered something uniquely valuable: legal opacity. Swiss banking secrecy, formally codified in 1934, is often discussed in terms of account numbers and secure vaults. Yet, long before this official codification, even in the 18th century, the region's city-states had already established reputations for discretion. Geneva, Zurich, Lucerne, these were not centers of ostentatious wealth, but rather discreet vaults beneath the open sky. A noble family seeking to safeguard assets from revolutionary mobs or unstable monarchs could quietly transfer holdings into Swiss trusts, confident that, unlike in France or Austria, no zealous bureaucracy would attempt their seizure. Consequently, over time, the Alpine landscape became dotted not only with chalets and convents, but also with armorial crests discreetly carved above doorways. A Roman prince might dispatch his second son to pursue studies at a Jesuit college in Fribourg. A Venetian count might acquire land in Vaud under a married name. And gradually, the intricate fabric of Swiss elite society began to intertwine with names drawn from the ancient scrolls of European nobility. As previously explored, certain Venetian and Roman houses successfully transitioned from overt power to financial anonymity. Switzerland became their formidable firewall, and not merely for wealth. It evolved into a repository for art, correspondence, historical records, and, occasionally, individuals. Exiled nobles, those who had fallen from favor or become politically inconvenient, could effectively disappear into a lakeside villa, emerging only for operas or discreet social gatherings. Some, indeed, never re-emerged at all. An illustrative case is the Salis family, minor Swiss nobility, who ascended in influence through strategic marriages to Italian aristocrats in the 19th century. By the early 20th century, their holdings encompassed banking shares, alpine resorts, and a surprising amount of real estate in Milan. The family's archives suggest quiet collaboration with Roman interests, including shared ownership of antiquities and a jointly held vault in Geneva. The public remained largely unaware, yet the ledgers meticulously recorded everything. Another, far more controversial example involves the exiled Habsburg line and its financial intermingling with older Catholic nobility. Following World War I, as national borders shifted and titles were abolished, assets required rapid and invisible relocation. Switzerland offered the obvious solution, and it was not solely the Habsburgs. Chigi, Massimo, Doria. Their names do not typically appear on Swiss street signs, yet their influence is whispered through notarial records and trust documents, sometimes coded under corporate Latinisms, decipherable only by a canon lawyer. This raises a persistent scholarly question. Did Switzerland merely provide refuge for ancestral wealth, or did it evolve into an active nexus within the Black Nobility's global network? Critics contend that it is simply a convenient tax haven, no different from the Cayman Islands. However, historians of European aristocracy highlight the specificity of these relationships. Unlike offshore jurisdictions designed for anyone with capital, Switzerland became the preferred vault of the old guard, those with ancestral claims, ecclesiastical ties, and multi-generational memory. Here is a detail not typically found in travel brochures. Several of Switzerland's most esteemed private banks were originally established with aristocratic seed capital. Not all of them endured in their original form, but the founding charters survive in dusty cantonal archives, bearing names with umlauts and vowels that trace back to the Black Nobility. Some of these banks eventually merged, dissolved, or rebranded. Yet the influence persists within governance structures, in the families still represented on advisory boards, and in the discreet trust companies headquartered in Lucerne office buildings bearing no external signage. The role of the Jesuits, once again, flickers at the periphery of this narrative. Jesuit universities in Switzerland frequently hosted the sons of Roman nobility, offering them both a rigorous education and a discreet network. A banker educated in Geneva could navigate between Rome, Vienna, and London without ever drawing undue public attention. except from those who truly mattered. Today, this legacy endures. Many aristocratic fortunes in Switzerland are held not directly, but through family foundations. These institutions, ostensibly charitable, often serve dual purposes, funding heritage projects, while simultaneously preserving control over real estate, artwork, and financial instruments. A Borghese heir might not appear in public papers, but the foundation he chairs quietly controls centuries-old vineyard rights in Tuscany, insured through Zurich, and tax-sheltered under cultural preservation clauses. One might walk through Basel, past a meticulously curated museum, and never suspect that the building was once an Orsini summer residence, or that the statue in its courtyard was part of a dowry granted in 1831. These elements are not explicitly hidden, nor are they publicly advertised. Such is the aristocratic approach: silence, not secrecy, presence without spectacle. So, the question remains, do the Black Nobility still hold court in the Alps, or are these merely the echoes of old spectres? The answer depends on one's definition of power. If it is loud, elected, and televised, then no. But if it is quiet, enduring, and embedded within the footnotes of Swiss legal codes, then perhaps they never truly departed. They simply observed the maps, perceived the mountains, and smiled. When the words powerful banking family are uttered to anyone with even a passing interest in conspiracy theories or hidden histories, the name Rothschild inevitably follows. They are, without question, one of the most publicly visible dynasties ever to command global finance, a name steeped in both legitimate achievement and near-mythic speculation. Yet, within the cloistered salons and private reading rooms of old nobility, a quieter, far more nuanced story exists, one that suggests the Rothschilds may not have been the ultimate masters of the game, but rather latecomers invited to participate and perhaps subtly managed. To comprehend this distinction, one must trace the perception. The Rothschilds, a Jewish banking family originating in Frankfurt, ascended to prominence in the late 18th and early 19th centuries through astute strategy and coordinated expansion across Europe. They constructed a multinational network with branches in London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt, each son overseeing operations in a separate city. They financed wars, underwrote infrastructure projects, and engaged in intricate financial maneuvers with national economies. However, the Black Nobility families had been weaving webs of influence long before the Rothschilds issued their first bond. Their control was less centralized, more fragmented, but often closer to the true levers of ecclesiastical and institutional power. Where the Rothschilds managed capital with military precision, the older noble families operated like an underground river, silent, winding, and exceptionally difficult to dam. An often overlooked moment in the mid-1800s illuminates this distinction. The Rothschilds played a pivotal role in financing the Papal States during a tumultuous financial crisis. Pope Gregory XVI reluctantly accepted their assistance, and contracts were formally signed between the Vatican and the Rothschild Bank in Naples. Yet, behind the scenes, the Roman noble families expressed outrage not because the Rothschilds were financiers, but because they were perceived as outsiders, Jewish, nouveau riche, and uninitiated in the tacit codes of dynastic control. According to private correspondence from the Chigi archive, now secured behind layers of legal red tape, several Black Nobility families vehemently objected to the arrangement. Some allegedly threatened to withdraw support for papal appointments. One even purportedly offered to match the Rothschild loan privately, on the condition that no external name appeared on the ledger. The offer was declined, but the sentiment of exclusion persisted. The Rothschilds were tolerated, not embraced. As previously discussed, noble families consistently favored discretion over public prominence. The Rothschilds, by contrast, became public legends. Their name adorned buildings, their marriages generated headlines, and caricatures circulated in newspapers across Europe, some admiring, many profoundly anti-Semitic. Yet, the Black Nobility remained in the shadows. Even their triumphs were often attributed to others. This creates the core misconception that the Rothschilds were the sole architects of global finance, rather than prominent, though not unchallenged, participants. Indeed, evidence suggests that older noble families, particularly those deeply embedded in Switzerland and Rome, maintained financial networks that intersected with Rothschild interests, but were never subordinated to them. In several instances, the Rothschilds acted as brokers for Vatican interests that originated with noble patrons. In others, they served as fronts, issuing bonds quietly backed by collateral from aristocratic estates. One obscure example: a Vatican loan in 1870, secured through Rothschild intermediaries, was implicitly backed by land in southern France, owned by a Colonna cousin. The name never appeared in the formal contract. The family's influence was exerted off paper, yet decisively. The Rothschilds garnered the headlines, the nobles retained the leverage. There is also the matter of marriage, or the lack thereof. While the Rothschilds famously practiced endogamy to preserve wealth and heritage, they were largely excluded from intermarriage with Catholic nobility. The Black Nobility, already intricately interwoven with Habsburgs, Bourbons, and other papal-aligned houses, rarely admitted new blood. Exceptions occurred, certainly, but they were infrequent and typically ceremonial. The unspoken social message was clear: admiration did not equate to acceptance. This tacit barrier persisted into the 20th century. Even as Rothschild institutions expanded their reach, they frequently did so alongside, not through, the older noble banking houses. In Zurich, for instance, Rothschild representatives collaborated with trust firms long rumored to be controlled by descendants of the Doria or Massimo lines. These were not partnerships of equality, but of convenience, and consistently, the noble names remained absent from the public masthead. This fuels an ongoing debate among modern historians. Did the Black Nobility merely coexist with the Rothschilds, or did they quietly direct them? Were the Rothschilds the public face, while the families of Rome and Venice remained the hand behind the curtain? Some contend this is fanciful, asserting that the Rothschilds operated independently, driven by Enlightenment rationalism and capitalism, not by old-world alliances. Others suggest that the Black Nobility, understanding the escalating reach of anti-Semitic rhetoric, allowed the Rothschilds to absorb blame and scrutiny that would otherwise have fallen upon Catholic aristocrats, an elegant and plausible deflection. One might have already observed this recurring pattern. The same families, employing similar tactics, embedded anonymity, strategic marriages, discreet trusts, and long-term memory. The Rothschilds captivated the world. The Black Nobility observed from their salons, adjusted their holdings, and ensured that the overarching narrative remained indistinct. Therefore, the next time someone suggests that the Rothschilds govern the world, one might pause. Consider who benefits from such a belief. Consider who remains unmentioned. Consider who never speaks and never has to. It is tempting to view the European Union as a modern innovation, a post-war economic marvel conceived to unite former adversaries in a shared future. Such is the narrative presented in educational institutions and treaties. Yet, beneath this surface, a deeper and older current flows, whispering of familiar names, ancestral ambitions, and dynasties that never truly vanished. The question is not whether aristocratic families influenced the genesis of the EU, but rather how profoundly their imprints are embedded within its foundational structures. As previously discussed, noble families transitioned from overt rule to institutional embedding in banks, universities, and religious orders. Their shift into supranational bodies was not abrupt. It was patient, discreet, the logical next step for those who had already mastered the art of continuity. Following the devastation of 2 world wars, Europe's aristocracy faced an existential challenge. Their castles were shelled, their titles derided, and their traditions dismissed by a world captivated by democracy and industrial progress. Yet, bloodlines endure, and those who survived acted as the Black Nobility had always done. They adapted. They sought permanence in new structures, not thrones, but treaties. Consider Jean Monnet, frequently hailed as a founding father of European integration. Though not himself a nobleman, he moved within circles that included both titled patrons and financiers with deep genealogical roots. His salons in Geneva and Paris were not merely intellectual incubators. They served as meeting grounds where aristocratic voices, now attired in the suits of modern technocrats, contributed to shaping ideas that would eventually become the European coal and steel community, and later the EU. A particularly compelling thread runs through the House of Habsburg. Nominally dethroned after World War I, it remained profoundly active in European politics. Otto von Habsburg, son of the last Austro-Hungarian emperor, became a member of the European Parliament in the 1972. He vehemently advocated for a united Christian Europe. While publicly framed in secular terms, his vision bore the unmistakable mark of imperial nostalgia. Unity not as a policy objective, but as an inherited right. Otto's connections spanned Catholic noble houses across the continent. He dined with princes of Liechtenstein, corresponded with Italian counts, and reportedly maintained private communications with Jesuit advisors in Rome. His coat of arms may have been out of fashion, but his address book remained very much in use. As explored in preceding chapters, noble families utilized strategic marriages and educational networks to navigate revolutions and the redrawing of borders. The EU, in many respects, became a new empire, a legal framework through which sovereign nations could be bound without a crown or a sword. And who better to operate within such an environment than families meticulously trained in precisely that form of quiet cohesion? Here is a detail often overlooked. Several early EU institutions were physically headquartered in cities with deep aristocratic roots: Strasbourg, Brussels, Luxembourg. These were not merely neutral choices, they were historically aristocratic hubs, places where elite families had long brokered agreements, hosted envoys, and governed duchies. The continuity was spatial as well as ideological. Furthermore, when examining the genealogical backgrounds of early European commissioners, advisors, and legal architects, a curious pattern emerges. A notable proportion possessed aristocratic ancestry, often diluted, unacknowledged, or simply deemed irrelevant to their official job descriptions, yet real nonetheless. One commissioner in the 1962 was the grandson of a papal knight. Another, a direct descendant of the Austrian Thurn und Taxis postal dynasty, discreetly shaped pan-European communication standards. This leads to an ongoing debate among historians. Were these noble traces incidental, the natural byproduct of a still class, conscious European society, or were they part of a broader continuity plan? One scholar, writing anonymously under the pseudonym Archivist27, posits that certain noble houses actively invested in think tanks, academic scholarships, and legal studies programs with the specific goal of cultivating ideologically sympathetic architects of European unity. The Jesuit connection surfaces again here, quietly but persistently. Jesuit-run universities in Belgium, France, and Italy produced a notable number of EU legal drafters and policy advisors. Many were the sons or grandsons of families with noble lineage, not necessarily titled, but connected. And through discreet alumni networks and retreats, these connections deepened. A subtle but telling example lies in the European Heritage Label, an EU initiative recognizing sites of shared historical value. While presented as inclusive and secular, several early designations were granted to aristocratic properties restored by foundations linked to ancient families. A castle in Austria, a monastery in France, a villa in Italy. The past, it seemed, had not only been remembered, but also curated by those whose ancestors had inhabited it. Skeptics, of course, exist. Critics argue that the EU's bureaucracy is too vast, too democratic, too unwieldy to be solely an instrument of noble engineering. However, that perhaps is its very genius. The visible complexity masks the invisible currents. A noble family does not need to directly control Brussels. They only require influence at key junctures in arbitration panels, in advisory committees, in cultural funding bodies. Influence flows like water through channels that others do not even perceive. As previously explored in Venice and Rome, families learn to exercise authority not by explicitly claiming it, but by strategically positioning themselves adjacent to it through marriage, patronage, or shared discretion. In the EU project, that tradition may well have found its modern manifestation, not as overt domination, but as participation so deeply embedded, it is frequently mistaken for coincidence. And so, the question remains, is European unification the realization of Enlightenment ideals? Or is it, at least in part, the latest chapter in the long game of noble continuity, a bloodless empire bound by regulation instead of conflict, quietly shaped by those who never truly departed? From the clanging of swords in medieval valleys to the drone of bombers over 20th century cities, war has invariably reshaped borders, rewritten laws, and rebranded ideologies. Yet, in the secluded back rooms, far removed from the front lines, war has also consistently functioned as an investment. For Europe's oldest families, particularly those intricately entwined with the Black Nobility, conflict became not merely survivable, but profitable. Power might be lost in a revolution, certainly, but it could also be repurchased with interest during the subsequent period of reconstruction. As previously discussed, the noble families transitioned from landholding to finance. That shift opened a gateway not merely to banking, but to the very machinery of war itself. As nation-states industrialized, warfare demanded factories, railroads, and sophisticated logistics. And who possessed the capital to fund such endeavors? Who held the political contacts to secure contracts, the cultural influence to subtly sway public opinion, the centuries of established trust required to channel funds through neutral intermediaries, the very names that had once chosen popes, now contributed to arming parliaments? In the 19th century, warfare no longer relied purely on monarchs and cavalry. It evolved into a business model. The Napoleonic Wars, often mythologized as grand battles for liberty and empire, were simultaneously vast markets for steel, saltpeter, and debt. And the noble families deftly played both sides. One branch of a family might ostensibly support Austria, while a cousin, through marriage or a silent partnership, financed French shipping contracts. Publicly, they were patriots. Privately, their interests were diversified. One example lies in the Borghese and Corsini networks. Both families, with deep papal ties, discreetly shifted portions of their portfolios into arms manufacturing during the unification of Italy, not directly, of course, but through intermediary companies that supplied uniforms, saddles, and even canned rations. Documents later unearthed in Florence revealed invoices tracing to heritage agricultural firms that had, during wartime spikes, suddenly pivoted into leather production. When the conflict concluded, they reverted to vineyards and olive oil, now possessing larger estates than before. Another curious case involves the Orsini. Once a towering Roman family of cardinals and condottieri, their modern descendants reportedly held shares in transport companies requisitioned during World War I. Italian troop movements necessitated coordination across fragmented infrastructure, and Orsini-backed firms controlled key rail segments in central Italy. Their profits surged in wartime, diminished in peacetime, and predictably escalated again in the 1940 seconds. Even more revealing are the connections between noble families and war insurance. As conflicts expanded in scale, so too did the demand for insuring ships, supplies, and factories. Several Swiss firms, long associated with noble advisory boards, quietly offered these services through shell corporations. A bombed warehouse might generate a government payout, which would then flow indirectly to a family trust in Lugano or Geneva. War became less a catastrophe and more a predictable line item on a balance sheet, scholars continue to debate the degree of coordination in these activities. Were noble families merely shrewd investors adapting to the tides of history, or were they actively shaping those currents, selecting wars that benefited their positions, whispering into the ears of ministers, and funding campaigns that conveniently destabilized rivals? A particularly ambiguous example from the Spanish Civil War illustrates this. Several aristocratic fortunes flowed into both sides of the conflict. A Massimo-linked endowment reportedly supported Catholic charities in Franco's territories, while a Borromeo-connected bank in Geneva discreetly handled fund transfers for Republican-aligned trade unions. When questioned decades later, both families professed ignorance. The relevant records had, conveniently, been lost during the transition. This pattern is not new. Even in the Renaissance, noble families navigated all angles, financing both papal armies and the mercenaries hired to oppose them. What changed in the modern era was scale. Wars became global, armaments evolved into industries, and noble influence became institutionalized. Enter the 20th century. As European warfare escalated into full industrial madness, aristocratic footprints faded from the battlefield but deepened within the corridors of logistics. Foundations originally created to preserve heritage began managing supply chains. Art trusts redirected profits into construction firms tasked with rebuilding bombed cities. One firm, co-chaired by a Chigi descendant, constructed post-war housing outside Naples while simultaneously restoring villas in Lazio. Both projects were funded by government grants, underwritten by foreign loans, handled, predictably, by private banks with ancient Roman roots. One might inquire how these families maintained influence while appearing so absent from the public eye. The answer lies in their structured approach. They did not own companies, they advised boards. They were not ministers. They were consultants or cultural attachés. A daughter might marry into a Belgian armaments dynasty. A son might become a lawyer for a NATO logistics contractor. Always proximate, never central. Influence without fingerprints. The open question persists. Was this strategy or inevitability? Could any family, even one with centuries of connections, truly plan for global war? Probably not. However, what they could do, and did repeatedly, was to position themselves such that, regardless of the outcome, they were integral to the reconstruction consistently, quietly. A recent study of post-World War II land transfers in northern Italy revealed that properties once confiscated from noble families under fascist regimes were returned, often with interest, to foundations controlled by their descendants. The process spanned decades, but it occurred, and many of the claimants utilized legal channels managed by law firms, staffed by Jesuit-trained solicitors and former Vatican advisors. Thus, we once again observe recurring patterns. War erupts, families bend, but they do not break. They wait, they leverage, and they rebuild. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. For the Black Nobility, war is not destruction, it is transition. The ascent of white smoke from the Sistine Chapel is intended to signify a divine choice, the guidance of the Holy Spirit, made manifest in a column of fragrant vapor. However, for those who comprehend the deeper mechanics of Vatican politics, the narrative is considerably less ethereal. Beneath the ritual, behind the locked doors and sealed ballots, lie centuries of maneuvering, influence, and indeed, familial stratagem. For when it comes to the selection of popes, the Black Nobility have long engaged in a game that is part chess, part theatre, and entirely their own. The College of Cardinals, often envisioned as a purely spiritual assembly, has never been immune to temporal concerns. Historically, many cardinals were sons of noble families. Their red robes were not merely religious symbols, they were the insignia of dynastic strategy. An Orsini cardinal did not represent solely God. He represented the continuation of Orsini influence. A Colonna seated in the Sistine Chapel was less a monk than a diplomat adorned with a mitre. Consequently, conclaves evolved into battlegrounds not of swords, but of favors, whispers, and meticulously timed illnesses. The process was designed to be secret, which rendered it ideal for the subtle shaping that noble families had mastered over generations. They did not always require their candidate to win. Sometimes, they merely needed an opposing candidate to lose. A fascinating example is found in the conclave of 1623. Maffeo Barberini emerged as Pope Urban VIII, an outcome widely believed to be a consequence, not solely of his own charisma, but of discreet support from multiple noble houses who stood to gain significantly from a compliant pontiff. Within months of his election, Barberini commenced redistributing church income, rewarding relatives with offices, and approving art commissions that subtly glorified the families who had supported him. As previously explored, noble families maneuvered through finance, marriage, and warfare. Conclaves enabled them to engage in all three, compressed into a few candlelit days behind locked doors. And because voting records were sealed, accountability was non-existent. Promises made in whispers could be discarded or fulfilled depending on the outcome. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, as papal authority was repeatedly challenged by secular revolutions, noble involvement did not wane. It intensified. The church remained one of the few enduring centers where noble titles still carried weight. Families such as the Torlonia, Chigi, and Massimo leveraged their roles as Vatican financiers and landowners to discreetly pressure papal candidates. If a cardinal's campaign required housing, resources, or logistical discretion, who better to provide it than a noble house possessing both infrastructure and a vested interest? One obscure but revealing incident occurred during the conclave of 1829. A cardinal renowned for his liberal leanings found his support mysteriously evaporating after an anonymous letter circulated among the electors, suggesting ties to Masonic circles. The source of the letter was never definitively traced, but the beneficiary of the shift, a conservative Roman aristocrat, was promptly promoted to Secretary of State by the newly elected Pope. Even in more recent times, vestiges of this influence persist. While modern popes are generally selected based on theological alignment and public image, there remain whispered consultations with families whose surnames appear in the Vatican's ledgers more frequently than in its press releases. A descendant of a Chigi line may not cast a vote, but he might host a dinner 2 weeks before the conclave, attended by key cardinals on vacation. The ongoing scholarly debate centers on whether these families continue to influence papal elections today. Some Vatican analysts insist the modern church is far too globalized, far too scrutinized to be manipulated by old Roman dynasties. Others point to the sustained presence of certain surnames, Borghese, Orsini, Colonna, within Vatican councils, art commissions, and even the Curia itself. Coincidence or quiet continuity? The Jesuit influence resurfaces here as well. Many papal candidates are Jesuit educated, and Jesuit institutions have long received donations from families of noble blood. While the Jesuit order publicly disavows political entanglement, their role as educators, confessors, and advisors frequently places them at the intersection of spiritual and strategic thinking. If a Jesuit cardinal ascends, to what extent was his worldview shaped by classrooms funded by ancient families? There is also the question of optics. Modern conclaves are imbued with symbolism, the closed doors, the silence, the solemn chants. Yet, those who study Vatican architecture recognize that the buildings themselves were designed and financed by the very families who sought to influence what transpired within. The floors of the Sistine Chapel were paid for by noble patrons. The tapestries bear family crests. Even the very throne upon which the newly elected Pope sits has, at times, been restored or reupholstered by foundations bearing names such as Aldobrandini or Pamphilj. Power in such spaces is layered. It is visual, it is spatial, and it is generational. Perhaps the most telling proof is what occurs after a conclave. Families that supported the successful candidate frequently receive subtle rewards not in public titles, but in restored privileges, Vatican museum commissions, or discreet access to diplomatic delegations. An art restoration grant here, a papal blessing for a private school there. These are not mere transactions, they are acknowledgements. Therefore, while the world awaits the white smoke, with cameras focused on the chimney, another world observes the shadows not to ascertain who becomes pope, but to confirm whether the lineage, the family, the legacy remains intact. Whispers in candlelit corridors, symbols carved into enduring stone, handshakes imbued with meanings known only to the initiated. Secret societies have long permeated the fringes of history, often blamed for revolutions, wars, assassinations, and unspeakable conspiracies. Yet, for the Black Nobility, these societies were rarely the primary source of power. They functioned as instruments, tools, sometimes cloaks, sometimes mirrors, and occasionally strategic levers. One might imagine secret societies as rebellious countercultures, Masons undermining monarchs, Templars guarding ancient truths, Rosicrucians plotting from hidden libraries. However, in many instances, these groups were populated not by radicals, but by the very class they are often perceived to oppose: nobles, counts, cardinals, and wealthy merchants. In essence, those who already possessed power and sought to preserve or expand it under layers of ritual and discretion. The Freemasons represent perhaps the most enduring example. Originating, at least publicly, in the early 18th century, they promoted ideals of brotherhood, enlightenment, and meritocratic advancement. Yet, behind the marble pillars and Latin mottos, Masonic lodges quickly became gathering places for Europe's elite, and crucially, for its noble class in transition. As monarchies weakened and republics emerged, many aristocrats discovered in Freemasonry a means to retain influence without requiring formal titles. A curious pattern exists. Many Black Nobility families with close papal ties also had members in Masonic lodges, despite the Vatican's public condemnations. This apparent contradiction was not hypocrisy, it was strategy. Membership afforded them access to political circles, mercantile networks, and colonial interests. And when the Church intensified its opposition, noble Masons simply shifted allegiance to more discreet rites or assumed honorary roles in affiliated clubs under different names. A Borghese cousin might attend a philosophical society in London, while an Orsini nephew joined a charitable brotherhood in Paris. Different names, same underlying network. The rituals may have changed, the fundamental intent did not. Then there were the Knights of Malta, an order both religious and sovereign, with deep roots in Crusader history. Originally founded to protect pilgrims and combat infidels, the order eventually transformed into a kind of aristocratic club with diplomatic status, international landholdings, and close Vatican ties. Membership, particularly among the Italian elite, conferred not merely honor but significant influence. The order could issue passports, establish embassies, and discreetly host meetings that no government could readily disrupt. As previously explored, noble families utilized marriage and Jesuit connections to extend their control. Secret societies offered a parallel channel, one operating beyond state borders under the guise of tradition, loyalty, and service. In the 20th century, some members of the Black Nobility served on advisory boards of the Order of Malta, while simultaneously holding positions on bank boards and cultural commissions. No conflict of interest was ever declared. After all, no one directly inquired. Another society of interest is Propaganda Due, or P2 Lodge, a Masonic group in post-war Italy linked to scandals, intelligence operations, and financial intrigue. Officially outlawed, it operated in the shadows, allegedly coordinating activities between politicians, financiers, and clerics. Several of its members bore aristocratic surnames, and while no direct evidence definitively links the Black Nobility to P2 leadership, circumstantial connections abound. A private bank backed by a noble family was reportedly used for transfers. A villa owned by a Chigi cousin hosted a key meeting. Documents mysteriously vanished. Scholars continue to debate the precise boundary between secret societies and mere social clubs. Was a gathering of Jesuit-educated bankers in Lucerne a fraternity or a financial syndicate? Did the Order of the Holy Sepulchre function as a religious honor or as a diplomatic shield for asset transfers? The very ambiguity is an integral part of the design. The Black Nobility did not need to control these groups, they only needed to be present. There is, of course, the perennial myth of the Illuminati. Originally founded in 1776 Bavaria as a rationalist society, the Illuminati were quickly suppressed, yet their legend endured. Conspiracists have attributed to them everything from the French Revolution to the European Central Bank. In most cases, these connections are highly speculative. However, some theorists argue that the myth persists because it serves a useful function. It diverts attention from the quieter, more plausible reality that genuine influence often emanates from centuries-old families rather than from shape-shifting cabals. And perhaps that is the essential insight. The Black Nobility did not invent secret societies. They adopted them, adapted them, utilized them as platforms when visibility was perilous, and as scapegoats when narratives required redirection. If a policy failed, blame the lodge. If an alliance needed protection, frame it as philanthropy. The families remained just off stage, never seen, never explicitly named, always intact. Modern examples still surface. An exclusive leadership conference in Geneva, attended solely by titled individuals and private equity heads, discreetly labeled a Heritage Preservation Summit. A Knights of Malta gala in Rome, whose guest list includes prominent banking executives, retired cardinals, and the occasional heir to an ancient French dukedom. These events are not clandestine, they are listed in glossy programs. However, the true discussions unfold between panels, over brandy. So, the open question remains. Do these societies still wield significant influence, or are they mere pageantry hollowed by time? The answer may lie in the reactions they elicit. Governments still monitor Masonic lodges. The Vatican still debates membership bans. Intelligence agencies still track donations and affiliations. And noble families continue to attend quietly, often anonymously, not as fanatics or masterminds, but as participants in a parallel history, one written not in manifestos but in whispered names. And if one has never received an invitation, well, that is likely the very essence of the point. The 19th century was characterized by profound upheaval. Cities burned, thrones fractured, and national borders were redrawn with each successive uprising. The old order trembled beneath the sound of marching boots and shouted slogans. France, Italy, Germany, Spain, one by one, monarchies were toppled, constitutions drafted, and the divine right of kings slowly dismantled. Yet, as the smoke cleared and republics ascended, certain names persisted, not emblazoned on banners, but etched into property deeds and institutional charters. The Black Nobility, once the overt face of power, became its enduring spectre. The revolutions of this era were not minor affairs. They were seismic, aimed squarely at the aristocracy. Land was seized, titles abolished, families exiled. However, for those who had long cultivated the art of quiet resilience, this chaos was not an ending. It was an opportunity. Where the newly wealthy scrambled to gain access, the ancient families already possessed maps and, more importantly, carefully planned escape routes. As previously discussed, the noble houses had already commenced a strategic migration into banking, diplomacy, and ecclesiastical influence. By the 1800s, their control of tangible assets, land, castles, military commissions, was diminishing. Yet, their grip on intangible assets, networks, trusts, cultural capital was only strengthening. In the face of revolution, they did not openly resist, they receded. They allowed the visible structures to fall, but ensured the underlying foundations remained under their control. Consider the Roman noble families during Italy's unification. The time's Risorgimento times threatened the very core of papal aristocracy. Streets resonated with nationalist songs, and Garibaldi's forces advanced to terminate centuries of ecclesiastical rule. Yet, Families such as the Chigi, Doria, and Massimo did not vanish. Instead, they reinvented themselves as civic patrons, restoring public fountains, funding hospitals, and donating libraries, all while discreetly transferring their wealth into Swiss vaults and Belgian holding companies. The revolutionaries erected statues, the Black Nobility constructed silence. A fascinating moment unfolded in France after the collapse of Napoleon III. The Second Empire disintegrated, and with it, many aristocratic fortunes. Yet, within a decade, some of those same families had re-emerged, not as dukes, but as influential board members. The House of Gramont, the House of Polignac, and even offshoots of the Bourbon-Orléans line found themselves quietly involved in railways, insurance firms, and wine cooperatives. Their traditional estates were technically gone, their influence had merely been rerouted. An old adage states, "When the flood comes, the fox builds a raft." For the Black Nobility, the revolutions of the 19th century were not a flood they feared. They were tides they had long anticipated. Well before revolutionaries declared republics, the nobles had begun transforming titles into trusts and privileges into diversified portfolios. A palazzo might be seized, but the mineral rights beneath it had already been discreetly sold to a cousin's firm in Bavaria. One particularly obscure example resides in the archives of Florence. A minor noble family, the Antinori, primarily known for their vineyards, transferred ownership of their lands to a philosophical society just months before republican laws were enacted. That society, in turn, leased the land back to the family's wine business at a fixed rate for 99 years. Technically, the property was no longer theirs. Functionally, nothing had changed. Scholars continue to debate the extent to which this retreat was coordinated. Was there a formal network, a shared plan, a cabal? Or was it simply the innate instinct of a class rigorously educated in contingency and continuity? Evidence suggests a combination of both. Correspondence between aristocratic families across France, Austria, and Italy reveals shared terminology euphemisms such as the grand pause, temporary stewardship, or inheritance reformation. In context, these appear to reference methods for shielding assets and titles from revolutionary scrutiny without relinquishing long-term control. And consistently, the Jesuits remained in close proximity. Many noble heirs received their education in Jesuit colleges far from revolutionary epicenters in Belgium, Switzerland, sometimes even South America. These institutions offered more than theology. They imparted languages, diplomacy, and economic theory, and they served as informal embassies, preserving noble networks while cities crumbled around them. Even in exile, the Black Nobility adapted. Some sought refuge in London and Vienna. Others emigrated to Latin America, where they established new estates under new names. A descendant of the Colonna line contributed to building a trade network between Argentina and Europe. A former Roman count married into a Spanish banking family and reappeared a generation later as a cultural philanthropist. Titles had become liabilities. Influence, however, remained a potent currency, and they expended it judiciously. There is a common misconception that revolution completely erases the past. Yet, upon closer inspection, the slate remains. Only the chalk has changed. Republics required infrastructure. Who better to provide it than the families who had managed it for centuries? Post-revolutionary governments needed stability. Who better to negotiate discreet loans than the former barons of shadow finance? Even nationalized industries frequently relied on consulting boards staffed by individuals whose grandfathers once governed duchies. Thus, a curious paradox emerged. The very forces intended to dismantle the aristocracy ultimately found themselves relying upon it. The nobles no longer ruled by inherent right, but by indispensable relevance. A museum founded in the ruins of a palace often bore the name of the family that once resided there, and was quietly funded by their foundation. This leads to an enduring question. Did the revolution succeed in dismantling the old order, or did they simply compel it to evolve? The answer lies in the margins in foundation deeds, in archival footnotes, in family offices registered under Latin mottos. The Black Nobility did not resist history, they anticipated it. And when the marchers arrived, the gates were already open, the walls already sold, and the families already elsewhere, waiting, observing, inheriting anew. In the smoky aftermath of the Great War, as monarchies collapsed and ideologies vied for dominance, a new, menacing force emerged in Europe: fascism. It marched in military boots, thundered from balconies, and promised a purified future. For many, it represented a profound rupture, a decisive break from the decadent aristocracies of the past. For others, particularly those with centuries of survival etched into their very being, it was an entirely different phenomenon, a test. And for the Black Nobility, it presented an opportunity, certainly cloaked in risk, but gleaming with the potential for continuity. Fascism, in both its Italian and German manifestations, offered an unusual paradox. It ostensibly exalted the common man while secretly courting the elite. It promised revolution while simultaneously emphasizing order. And within the shadows of this inherent contradiction, noble families discovered room to maneuver. After all, they had weathered empires, revolutions, and even excommunication. A man in a new uniform presented nothing fundamentally new, only the insignia had changed. In Italy, Mussolini's rise was publicly hostile to the aristocracy. He mocked titles, railed against the Vatican, and styled himself as the progenitor of a new Roman Republic. Yet, privately, many noble families remained unaffected, some even thrived. The Torlonia family, whose lineage was intricately entwined with papal finance, maintained vast estates throughout the fascist period. Their land was never seized. Indeed, they hosted official events and diplomatic functions. Rarely published photographs exist of black-shirted dignitaries dining beneath Torlonia chandeliers, toasting the empire with crystal goblets etched with centuries-old crests. This was not blind allegiance, it was a transaction. The regime sought legitimacy, the families sought survival. And while Mussolini's rhetoric blazed with anti-clerical fervor, his policies proved far more flexible, especially following the Lateran Treaty of 1929, which restored Vatican sovereignty and reaffirmed certain aristocratic privileges. Many members of the Black Nobility played discrete roles in brokering that agreement. Their profound knowledge of canon law and access to family archives proving more durable than bayonets. As discussed in earlier chapters, noble families adapted during revolutions, shifting roles, redefining titles, and embedding themselves in neutral institutions. Fascism demanded a similar response. It was not met with overt outrage. It was absorbed with cautious deliberation. A son might join the military under a new flag. A cousin might donate a villa for party use. Yet, behind closed doors, the ancient habits persisted. The archives remained locked, the foundations stayed funded, and the bloodlines, as always, endured. Germany's situation was more volatile. The Nazi regime, with its virulent anti-Semitism and obsession with racial purity, created a complex environment for aristocratic families. Many noble German houses initially supported Hitler's ascent, perceiving him as a bulwark against Bolshevism and a potential pathway to a return to imperial order. Some even served in high-ranking positions: military, diplomatic, and even within the SS leadership. Yet, as the regime radicalized, tensions escalated. The older aristocracy found itself simultaneously elevated and intensely scrutinized. For Catholic nobility with ties to Rome, including branches of Italian families settled in Bavaria and Austria, the situation was even more precarious. Some quietly resisted, aiding Jesuit networks and Vatican liaisons who smuggled Jews and dissidents to safety. Others, more pragmatically, aligned with the Reich's cultural initiatives, curating museums, funding heritage publications, and ensuring their family estates remained unconfiscated. One lesser-known example is the Bavarian Italian Prince Doria, who held estates in both Munich and Lazio. During the war, his properties were used alternately by German officers and Vatican envoys. He was never formally charged with collaboration, nor publicly lauded for resistance. His official biography is silent, yet the estate remains in family hands. There is, of course, a darker aspect to this accommodation. Some noble families did more than merely survive, they prospered. Wartime contracts flowed through trusted intermediaries. Art confiscated from Jewish collectors occasionally found its way into private salons. Names were meticulously kept off paperwork, and foundations acted as discreet buyers. And when the war concluded, restitution cases frequently encountered missing records, misplaced inventories, and mysteriously empty vaults. Scholars debate the extent of this complicity. Some argue the Black Nobility had no choice, that survival necessitated compromise. Others contend that for certain families, fascism represented less a threat than a mere authoritarian, hierarchical system steeped in pageantry and tradition. And while public allegiance was discouraged by the church, private sympathies often blurred. Nevertheless, certain lines were not crossed. When Mussolini was ousted and the Nazis occupied Rome, several noble families offered covert aid to Vatican officials and political refugees. The Colonna Library, according to unpublished diaries, became a temporary shelter for escaped prisoners. A Doria-funded chapel quietly concealed resistance correspondence beneath its altar. These acts were not publicized, they were not even confessed. They functioned as insurance policies, both spiritual and political. And so, when the war ended and Europe began to rebuild, these families did what they had always done. They reappeared not in parliaments, but in planning commissions, not on front pages, but in advisory councils. Their lands were largely untouched. Their art remained on their walls. Their names, if sullied, were swiftly rehabilitated by new patrons, new regimes. One might inquire, was this survival or complicity? Was the Black Nobility resisting fascism from within, or quietly propping it up? The answer, as usual, lies in the nuance. They were neither heroes nor villains. They were continuity incarnate, capable of donning the robes of the church, the suits of the banker, and, when circumstances demanded, the tailored uniform of a diplomat smiling alongside the regime. Their allegiance was not to ideology, it was to permanence, and permanence, in the end, invariably finds a way. The war had concluded. Cities lay in ruins, and Europe's maps had been redrawn in ash and ink. Yet, even amidst the devastation, the Black Nobility did not vanish. They adapted, they observed, and then they rebuilt not merely physical structures, but networks, the kind that possessed no fixed addresses, no uniforms, no national flags. These were not the opulent salons of the 18th century, nor the clandestine conclaves of old. These were quiet handshakes in neutral cafes, discreet bank meetings in Geneva, and sealed Vatican envelopes that never passed through customs. If fascism had been tolerated or navigated, the post-war order demanded even greater finesse. The continent was now starkly divided, East versus West, communism versus capitalism. Yet, within that division, the noble families discovered another opportune opening. As the world became preoccupied with nuclear alliances and sophisticated spycraft, the ancient aristocracy once more found relevance, frequently engaging with both sides, always prioritizing continuity. As previously discussed, Vatican diplomacy had long been intricately interwoven with noble patronage. That bond did not sever in 1945, it deepened. The post-war church faced a fragmented flock, and the old families offered stability. Foundations bearing noble names became benefactors for reconstruction efforts, restorers of churches, and patrons of universities. However, they also evolved into something more: conduits. Consider the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, IOR. It served both spiritual and financial functions, and during the 1950 seconds and 60 seconds, It became a discrete conduit for moving capital between nations, churches, and occasionally, less sanctified entities. The IOR was led not solely by clergy, but was advised behind the scenes by laymen from Italy's oldest families. Transparency was minimal, influence maximal. One particularly murky example is the Sindona affair. Michele Sindona, a Sicilian banker with reported ties to both the Vatican and organized crime, managed substantial financial flows during the Cold War, allegedly including CIA funds, mafia-laundered cash, and Vatican assets. Yet, behind Sindona were older names. He did not invent the financial structures, he inherited them. Reports later connected some of his operations to noble families who had quietly supported his rise, utilizing him as a proxy in financial spheres where direct involvement would have been deemed inappropriate. Similarly, the Banco Ambrosiano scandal of the early 1982, involving fraudulent loans, mysterious deaths, and vast black holes in the Vatican's balance sheet, hinted at deeper roots. The chairman, Roberto Calvi, found hanging beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge, was infamously dubbed God's banker. However, the networks he operated within included legal firms, foundations, and holding companies still bearing names traceable to Renaissance Rome. These were not accidental overlaps, they were inherited corridors. Beyond finance, there was diplomacy. The Cold War opened new theaters: UNESCO, NATO, the UN, the European Commission. And here too, the Black Nobility found footholds. A Borghese heir might serve as an ambassador to a small neutral country. A Colonna descendant might advise a UN heritage project in the Middle East. These roles, while seemingly ceremonial, provided cover, access, and the one commodity these families valued above all else: placement. Placement implied that information flowed through them, that alliances could be subtly influenced, that projects could be either delayed or accelerated. They were not governing the world, they were maintaining ancient lines of sight, keeping their hands gently on the wheel, even as governments rose and fell like waves upon a tiled floor. Scholars continue to debate the degree of coordination in these efforts. Was there a formal noble cabal secretly shaping the post-war world? Likely not. However, something perhaps more effective existed: shared memory, a culture of continuity passed down not through manifestos but through family dinners, Latin inscriptions in private libraries, and the gradual education of heirs in Jesuit schools and Geneva firms. The question of morality, of complicity, is more complex. Did noble families shelter war criminals? Some certainly did. Did they also finance resistance movements? Again, yes. The objective was not ideology. It was resilience, survival, and, in some cases, rehabilitation. One Austrian noble family, stripped of its lands during the Anschluss, regained them through a legal foundation established in Liechtenstein. Another, long exiled from Naples, returned in the 1952 as an art patron and quietly reacquired 3 former family villas through a Luxembourg holding firm. Even the arts became a strategic zone. Post-war restoration campaigns, often led by UNESCO or EU bodies, relied on public-private partnerships. And who supplied the private? Noble foundations. Paintings once seized were now repurchased. Estates nationalized during the war were quietly leased to tourism boards, managed by shell companies bearing the faint fingerprints of Black Nobility descendants. And once again, the Jesuits were interwoven throughout, serving as educators, advisors, and confessors. Jesuit universities produced economists and diplomats who moved effortlessly between Rome and Washington, between Brussels and Buenos Aires. One Doria heir, educated at Georgetown, became a consultant for World Bank heritage projects while maintaining board roles in 3 family trusts with centuries-old roots in Vatican land leases. So, where does this leave us? The post-war world, loud with treaties and doctrines, rarely mentioned nobility. But they were present not as lords, not as generals, but as board members, consultants, restorers, operating behind the scenes, still fluent in Latin and balance sheets, still preferring candlelight to camera flashes. Perhaps the most enduring image of this era is not a battlefield or a treaty table, but a room in Geneva, white walls, polished wood, a modest painting of street. Jerome. Two men sit opposite each other. One wears a suit from Savile Row, the other a priest's collar. They discuss debt forgiveness for a small post-colonial state. On the table, beside a fountain pen and two espressos, lies a thin folder stamped with a name last prominent in 1583. And outside, no reporters, no statues, just another day in the afterlife of aristocracy. In the autumn of 1968, a small select group of economists, scientists, industrialists, and statesmen convened in a quiet villa near Rome. The world outside was turbulent, marked by widespread protests, accelerating technological advancements, Cold War brinkmanship, and a growing apprehension that the modern system, for all its outward confidence, was beginning to falter. That gathering would give birth to the Club of Rome, a think tank that would later profoundly impact global discourse with its report. The Limits to Growth, a sobering model, forecasting environmental and economic collapse if unchecked consumption continued. Yet, behind the graphs and algorithms, behind the lexicon of systems theory and sustainability, some contend that the true legacy of the Club of Rome lies in the hands that initiated its formation, and some of those hands, notably, were encased in very old velvet. As previously explored, the Black Nobility transitioned from holding titles to managing trusts, from palazzos to policy. By the mid-20th century, many had become invisible stewards, overseeing not kingdoms, but narratives. The Club of Rome, officially founded by Italian industrialist Aurelio Pecce and Scottish scientist Alexander King, was welcomed at the highest levels of European intellectual and diplomatic society. However, it also, curiously, received discreet patronage from families whose names had not appeared in the press for decades. Families whose fortunes were once intricately intertwined with papal elections, crusader orders, and feudal power structures. One such name was Aldobrandini. While not publicly listed in Club of Rome documents, several sources, including correspondence archived in Geneva, indicate that properties owned by Aldobrandini foundations were utilized for early meetings, and that quiet funding was channeled through affiliated cultural preservation organizations. These individuals were not overt board members, they were facilitators, protectors, providers of space, cover, and continuity. What is most fascinating is the thematic shift. The Black Nobility had long survived by adapting from sword to ledger, from conclave to bank. Now, they began to engage with global governance through the language of environmentalism and long-term planning. In place of a crown or a cardinal's ring was a systems model predicting global population overshoot by 2050. This was not merely a rebranding, it was a profound evolution. Influence was reassembled using the vocabulary of data. The club's landmark report, published in 1972, was dismissed by some as alarmist. Yet, within elite circles, it instigated deep reflection and concrete action. Governments established new environmental agencies. Policy think tanks proliferated. Global conferences were convened, and throughout it all, a subtle theme persisted. The critical need for central coordination, technocratic guidance, and above all, legacy thinking. Herein lies the profound connection. Legacy. The very families who had traditionally thought in terms of centuries were now being informed that the world might only have decades remaining. It represented a natural synergy. While politicians contended over electoral cycles, the descendants of Roman nobility were sponsoring long-range climate forecasts and conservation treaties, not necessarily out of pure altruism, but because the world, much like their ancestral estates, necessitated careful stewardship. This implied governance driven not by fleeting popularity, but by enduring continuity. One of the more peculiar links involves Principessa Ruspoli, a name drawn from ancient Roman and Spanish nobility. Though never publicly affiliated with the club, she was documented attending a related environmental summit in the early 1982. The minutes of that meeting reference her foundation's interest in discrete heritage conservation alongside sustainable regional planning. In less bureaucratic terms, she sought to preserve the land, the estate, the lineage under the guise of ecological concern. This pattern recurs. Noble family trusts began investing in reforestation programs, sponsoring academic chairs in ecological theology, and funding obscure think tanks dedicated to planetary ethics. In theory, these were progressive causes. In practice, they created new channels of soft power influence without holding public office, shaping minds rather than drafting laws. A curious scholarly debate emerged in the early 2000s. To what extent did the post-war noble class contribute to shifting the global conversation from war to climate, from territorial disputes to planetary boundaries? Critics argue this is romanticism, that the true drivers were data and geopolitics. However, proponents point to private correspondence and meeting rosters that suggest something more deliberate. That behind the new global technocracy stood a very ancient instinct to preserve, to endure, to direct. This brings us to the broader implications. For the Club of Rome was not an isolated experiment, it became a model. Other organizations followed: the Trilateral Commission, the World Economic Forum, the Bilderberg Group. These were not overt conspiracies, but sophisticated networks, and within them, a familiar presence nobility, no longer introduced with trumpets, but with credentials, not lords, but trustees, not rulers, but attendees. An open question persists. Are these families truly shaping the future, or merely placing their hands on the shoulders of those who are? Are they architects or curators? Whatever the case, their presence endures. A Massimo cousin on a biodiversity council, a Chigi descendant, quietly advising on architectural heritage in climate-threatened regions. A Doria family trust investing in clean water startups. None of it illegal, none of it ostentatious, all of it familiar, and perhaps that is the most telling sign of all. That in an age obsessed with disruption, these families continue to think in terms of preservation not just of buildings, but of influence, not just of forests, but of legacies. They predated the birth of many nations. They intend to endure long after they fade. And whether the future arrives in carbon credits or climate councils, their seat at the table has already been meticulously carved. There are names that history prominently remembers: Napoleon, Luther, Caesar, names that explode, flare, and resonate through textbooks. Yet there are other names, the ones that never truly departed the inner chambers, the ones whispered rather than shouted, names that do not headline revolutions, but quietly inherit them. These are the names of the Black Nobility, and they persist. Not necessarily in grand castles, nor always in overt political roles, but present in the foundations, the land registries, the directorship filings, and the often unquestioned footnotes of institutions. Families such as the Orsini, Massimo, Borghese, Colonna, and Chigi no longer wield scepters. They wield portfolios. They chair advisory boards. They guide cultural policy. They manage heritage assets valued at hundreds of millions, all while appearing to be mere relics of a long-closed historical chapter. But that chapter, as is now evident, was never truly concluded. Let us commence with the Massimo family, one of Europe's most ancient noble lines. They trace their lineage, with varying degrees of scholarly credibility, back to the times gens Fabia times of ancient Rome. More significantly, their presence in Rome has never truly faltered. In the modern era, they have functioned as bankers, lawyers, property developers, and diplomats. A Prince Massimo served in the Vatican's diplomatic corps until the early 2000s. Another Massimo heir, educated in London and fluent in 5 languages, holds a position on the board of a prominent Italian telecommunications firm. His title is technically ceremonial. His influence, nonetheless, is measurable. And they are not alone. The Orsini name, once prominently featured on papal ballots and battlefield reports, now appears in real estate holdings in Lazio, cultural preservation projects, and academic fellowships. A discrete Orsini endowment contributes to funding Vatican archival digitization. Another underwrites archaeological excavations in North Africa. Inquiring of the appropriate archivist in Rome might reveal that a particular villa, now listed as a national heritage site, is administratively managed by an Orsini cousin through a family trust based in Luxembourg. The Borghese family, as ever, remains intricately intertwined with the arts. Their villa is now a museum, certainly, but the Borghese Foundation continues to advise on restoration projects across Europe. Several Borghese heirs serve on cultural commissions, one of whom discreetly assisted in negotiating restitution terms for looted artworks repatriated from post-war Germany. An heir, no longer formally titled, operates a vineyard producing a wine that consistently garners global awards, marketed with Latin phrases that only a few thousand individuals on Earth can fluently translate. Then there is the Colonna. Their palazzo still stands, and portions of it remain in family hands. More intriguingly, a Colonna descendant has been active in international legal circles, advocating for religious heritage protections. She does not publicize her lineage, nor does she need to. Her name opens doors, discreet ones, the kind without prominent doorknobs. The Chigi family's influence has transitioned into banking and philanthropic endeavors. One foundation bearing the Chigi name holds substantial shares in conservation-focused exchange-traded funds, ETFs. Another sponsors ethical investment research at a Jesuit university. And though the family no longer resides in its ancestral palazzo, now home to Italy's prime minister, their other properties, managed through shell firms and silent partnerships, generate significant annual revenue. The marble halls may echo less, perhaps, but the income stream does not. What is most remarkable is how little these families court public attention. Their websites, if they exist, are sparse. Their public appearances are rare. Yet, their names still appear in elite registries, private clubs, on Milan Art Fair guest lists, and at discreet side events during Davos. They do not seek to dominate a room, nor do they desire to. They simply endure. There is an ongoing question in scholarly circles regarding the meaning of this persistence. Some perceive these families as cultural stewards, guardians of heritage, legacy, and aesthetics. Others argue they are simply aristocracy rebranded, still subtly maneuvering through influence, while the rest of the world endeavors to catch up. The truth likely lies somewhere between these interpretations. Their visibility is selective, their power is refracted. What truly distinguishes them from the merely wealthy is their relationship with time. These families do not operate on quarterly earnings or electoral cycles. Their plans span decades, sometimes centuries. An attractive land parcel is not merely an asset, it represents continuity. A museum endowment is not simply charity, it constitutes an enduring footprint. And a discreet presence on a university board is not merely prestige, it is strategic positioning. Even their missteps offer instruction. When a scandal does arise, a bankruptcy, a failed investment, a lawsuit, the family name rarely suffers lasting damage. The underlying structure absorbs the shock. A nephew resigns, a trust dissolves, a lawyer issues a statement, and the crest carved into stone above a chapel door endures. So, what are the implications for contemporary observation? It implies that in a world obsessed with novelty, there remain bloodlines that rely upon patience. In a culture that shouts, they whisper. And in a society that frequently trades identity for ephemeral virality, they remain intrinsically themselves. One might encounter them in Rome, Paris, or Zurich. They will not overtly distinguish themselves. However, one might discern the subtle details. A lapel pin in the shape of a phoenix, a Latin inscription on a marble lintel, a surname that has not appeared on an electoral ballot in 2 centuries, and never required to. For some names do not merely rise, they persist. One is likely familiar with the most conspicuous titans of the financial world, the banks with towering glass edifices, the hedge funds emblazoned with bold logos, the CEOs who ceremoniously ring the bell at the stock exchange. Yet, beneath the dazzling lights of capitalism's stage, another economy silently hums older, more discreet, and considerably less photogenic. This is the domain where the Black Nobility continues to operate. Their instruments are not front-page mergers or CNBC interviews. They are private trusts, offshore holdings, century-old foundations, and cross-generational networks of fiduciary discretion. It is not that the families of the Black Nobility universally own all major banks. It is that they comprehend how to maintain control without being seen to possess it. Let us commence with trusts, the preferred instrument of those who seek to retain control without overt visibility. One will not find a Massimo or Colonna listed as the CEO of a major bank. However, their name might be discreetly embedded within a Cayman Islands entity that controls a holding company, which in turn holds shares in a Swiss investment firm, which then possesses a controlling interest in a family office, managing several billion euros. Attempting to trace such a structure through public records would likely lead one to encounter phrases such as discretionary beneficiary, revocable structure, or the always reassuring intergenerational wealth stewardship. The fundamental objective is opacity, not necessarily to conceal wrongdoing, but to preserve autonomy. These families, steeped in centuries of compelled adaptation from papal shifts to fascist regimes to technocratic Europe, learned long ago that power is most securely held when it is dispersed, anonymized, and shrouded in continuity. Consequently, rather than appearing on public rich lists, they appear in board minutes. Rather than headlining a new fund, they meticulously draft the charter that governs it. Consider, for example, the Vatican-linked IOR, or Institute for the Works of Religion, often referred to as the Vatican Bank. This benignly named institution, long associated with controversy, has been investigated for money laundering, covert transfers, and political manipulation. Time and again, threads have emerged linking it to noble family names not overtly, but through associated intermediaries, overlapping board memberships, or advisory figures possessing hereditary titles. The evidence is suggestive, but not prosecutable. One is left with patterns, recurring instances of the same surnames, the same legal firms, the same investment shells. When such coincidences accumulate, distinct patterns invariably emerge. Then there is Switzerland, the mythic safe haven. Swiss banking secrecy is no longer what it once was, yet its legacy endures. Several modern Colonna and Orsini descendants are connected to Geneva-based family offices. These offices rarely advertise. They operate through networks of wealth managers who specialize in legacy preservation. One manager, speaking off record, described his clients as European names that never show up on Forbes but could buy half the list. Their assets are diverse: commercial real estate, vintage vineyards, historic art, renewable energy patents, and even cryptocurrency mines registered under shell entities in Eastern Europe. What safeguards all this? Legal expertise and abundance of it. A noble family today is often less a familial unit and more a sophisticated legal apparatus, intricately interwoven with trust lawyers, tax architects, and corporate service providers who specialize in creating, maintaining, and defending privacy structures across multiple jurisdictions. The result is influence without exposure, ownership without press, wealth without public renown. Modern finance itself, with its derivatives, high-frequency trades, and tokenized assets, may appear too fast-paced for such ancient families. However, precisely because it is fast-paced, it demands long-term anchors, and that is precisely what these families offer. When a technology startup seeks patient capital, where do they often turn? to a discreet Luxembourg fund that traces its origins to a Sicilian surname. When a museum requires backing for a new wing, who quietly funds that wing in exchange for no public plaque? Sometimes, it is a Borghese trust with a particular appreciation for Flemish oil paintings. When a Catholic university launches a discreet initiative to expand its endowment, who steps in with centuries of financial discretion? One can infer there is an ongoing debate regarding whether these families seek influence for influence's sake, or simply wish to preserve what they already possess. Some researchers argue that the Black Nobility's grip on finance is now passive, like a mountain casting a shadow not because it actively leans forward, but simply because it exists. Others suggest a more active role: the quiet placement of protégés in asset management firms, the utilization of ancient diplomatic ties to secure favorable trade zones, or the subtle influence over ESG, environmental, social governance, investment criteria that align with Catholic values and noble heritage. The historical echoes are undeniably present. They have been previously discussed, from Medici manipulation of loans, to papal relatives, to Venetian merchant families embedding bankers in foreign courts, to Borghese art dealings that disguised financial flows. All these patterns resurface, now repackaged in spreadsheets and sophisticated asset diversification strategies. One example particularly stands out. A Malta-based investment fund, registered in the name of an anonymous trustee, acquired significant shares in a northern Italian biopharma company. The fund's lead legal advisor was a boutique Roman law firm founded by a Chigi descendant. The company's new PR head was a woman whose grandmother once danced with Prince Massimo at a Vatican gala. Is this a conspiracy? Not necessarily, but it is an environment where influence is not overtly announced. It is implied, inherited, and communicated through strategic proximity. Yet, power does not always reside in what is owned. Sometimes, it is in what is time's permitted asterisk. A noble family does not need to control a central bank. It only needs to make a phone call to delay a regulatory shift, or host a discreet retreat at a Tuscan villa attended by precisely the right EU commissioners, or endow a think tank whose white papers miraculously align with the family's investment strategy. Therefore, while the world fixates on the next unicorn IPO, these families measure their victories differently. A law that failed to pass, a tax that remained unchanged, a name that stayed out of the public papers. They have not vanished, they are simply more adept at remaining unseen. Ultimately, the persistent question revolves around proof tangible, signed, notarized evidence. For without it, the Black Nobility remains an elegant myth, compelling, intricate, and maddeningly unverifiable. Yet, as one has likely begun to discern, something genuinely substantial underpins this narrative. The challenge lies in accurately distinguishing between demonstrable historical patterns and imaginative projection. To be clear, very few modern academics will unequivocally state that the Black Nobility constitutes a confirmed, centralized force actively steering today's global affairs. They will reference the term as it was used in 19th century papal politics, or acknowledge the well-documented wealth and historical prominence of families like the Orsini, Colonna, and Borghese. However, inquire if these families wield control over international finance or manipulate world events through opaque foundations, and academics will likely either offer a polite chuckle or become notably reticent. This is not because such possibilities are inherently impossible, but because they are exceedingly difficult to prove. That is the fundamental battleground. The Black Nobility narrative endures precisely because it inhabits the shadows realms where money leaves no obvious fingerprints and influence arrives without a receipt. Attempting to uncover evidence through offshore registries or multi-layered charitable entities is more likely to yield dead ends than definitive declarations. It is not that the paper trail is absent, it is that the trail was never intended to be followed. Nevertheless, fragments of information exist, perhaps sufficient to unsettle the complacent. Consider, for instance, the Vatican's banking history. The Institute for the Works of Religion, IOR, a benignly named institution with a long history of scandal, has been investigated for money laundering, covert transfers, and political manipulation. Repeatedly, investigative threads have emerged linking it to noble family names, not overtly, but through associated intermediaries, overlapping board memberships, or advisory figures possessing hereditary titles. The evidence is suggestive, yet not legally prosecutable. One is left with patterns, recurring instances of the same surnames, the same legal firms, the same investment shells. Or consider the post-war period in Italy, where journalists like Licio Gelli, a controversial figure himself, alluded to ancient bloodlines still controlling the vital arteries of Italian power. Some dismiss Gelli as a self-mythologizing eccentric. Others highlight that many of his claims, initially ridiculed, quietly came to light years later. He spoke of noble families funding secret political initiatives, influencing currency policies, and utilizing aristocratic estates as meeting grounds for post-fascist realignments. The direct proof may be sparse, yet the consistency is unsettling. Even modern investigations into offshore leaks, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, have occasionally stumbled upon legacy family trusts tied to centuries-old European surnames. When probed, these entities typically issue concise press releases affirming that all structures are legal and tax compliant, which may indeed be true. However, legality and transparency are not synonymous. There is also the curious persistence of noble orders. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta, for example, still maintains sovereign status, issues its own passports, and holds diplomatic relations with over 100 countries. Although publicly engaged in humanitarian work, the order is closely associated with elite European bloodlines and has long functioned as a discrete club where religion, nobility, and diplomacy intersect. Some critics argue that its modern iteration serves as a reputational shield for financial and political networking of the highest order. Again, there is no definitive smoking gun, merely a recurring pattern, a whisper behind the pageantry. This raises the more profound question: what constitutes proof when investigating systems meticulously designed to avoid leaving such evidence? In conspiracy culture, the Black Nobility has become a catch-all, a shadowy bogeyman employed to explain everything from the price of oil to the outcome of papal elections. This is dangerous territory because it obscures the more reasonable and nuanced argument that historical families, through enduring wealth and multi-generational strategy, continue to exert influence in ways far less visible than in previous centuries, yet no less real. And in that ambiguous zone, the very absence of evidence, paradoxically, becomes part of the narrative. After all, is it more suspicious to observe a family's name at the center of every document, or to witness its complete omission, particularly when one knows it historically occupied that position? One final complication exists. When investigating the Black Nobility, one is often navigating a hall of mirrors. Some documents were fabricated by cranks. Some truths were deliberately suppressed by the families themselves. And some of the most sensational theories were possibly disseminated by intelligence agencies, seeking to discredit or confuse legitimate lines of inquiry. During the Cold War, for example, documented instances of disinformation campaigns aimed at discrediting Vatican-connected figures occurred, sometimes by linking them to fabricated noble plots, a conspiracy about a conspiracy. It becomes nearly impossible to discern where truth ends and intentional deception begins. As explored in Section 12, regarding the misconceptions surrounding the Rothschilds, that episode illustrated how plausible narratives can be distorted, magnified, and redirected, often intentionally. The Black Nobility theory faces the same inherent risk: genuine influence intertwined with imaginative conjecture, amplified by paranoia. Yet, underneath it all, the same names consistently resurface, the same estates, the same discrete foundations, the same forms of power that never required public acclaim to endure. So, What course of action is suggested by all this? One should remain vigilant, one should question, one should meticulously trace the lines that are traceable and remain acutely aware of those that are not. One must remember that the most profound form of power is not overt control. It is the capacity to conceal one's hand while leading the world to believe it played the cards itself. Perhaps the proof sought is not a single document or confession. Perhaps it is the pattern itself, the echo of centuries resounding beneath our feet. Having followed this intricate thread thus far, through whispered conversations in Venetian alleys, candlelit conclaves in Roman palazzos, and beneath the marble stillness of Swiss vaults, one might still ponder the ultimate question that truly matters amidst all the speculation, theories, and shadows. Is there any tangible, visible evidence, however faint, that such a hidden nobility genuinely persists in the contemporary era? The answer is affirmative, but only if one possesses the acumen to discern where and how to observe. It commences, somewhat deceptively, with something remarkably ordinary: weddings. Not just any weddings, of course, but those discreetly held in castles inaccessible to tourists, between heirs of names that once bore titles such as prince or duke. These unions no longer command front-page headlines. They are neither scandals nor public spectacles. Yet, their details appear in obscure registry records, or in the footnotes of publications dedicated to monitoring aristocracy, those written more for the preservation of tradition than for mass consumption. One will find surnames like Colonna, Massimo, or Chigi listed alongside minor royalty from Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, or defunct Balkan dynasties. Not ostentatious, not loud, but meticulously preserved, generation after generation. Marriages of this nature are significant, not for romantic narratives or glittering tiaras, but because they meticulously maintain networks, not those constructed of fiber optics, but those forged from blood, enduring loyalty, and shared memory. While the rest of the world updates LinkedIn profiles, these families perpetuate continuity through solemn ceremony, ingrained ritual, and contracts sealed with red wax and meticulously inscribed in Latin. Then there are the institutions, foundations, and think tanks, often headquartered in palatial buildings, but never televised. The Club of Rome, previously referenced, continues to operate with astonishing discretion despite its global reach. It advocates for sustainable development and global equity, undeniably noble causes. However, its meetings attract a unique blend of aristocratic lineage and technocratic elite, a convergence that appears to be far more than mere coincidence. And occasionally, the guest lists include names that have not appeared on electoral ballots in centuries, yet whose influence never necessitated such visibility. In the realm of finance, the web grows more complex and, paradoxically, more visible. Consider, for instance, the utilization of ancient noble estates as registered headquarters for multinational holding companies. At first glance, one observes a picturesque countryside villa with an attached wine label. Upon closer inspection, the same address is listed as the base for a Luxembourg-based shell company holding assets in Panama. This is curious. Stranger still is when the surname associated with that holding matches a noble house that, officially, has not wielded overt power since the era of Napoleon. We also begin to observe modern aristocracy re-entering public life under various guises. Cultural philanthropy often serves as a common entry point. A Massimo hosting a biennial exhibition, a Borghese curating a Vatican-affiliated art restoration project, a Medici descendant speaking at a sustainability conference in Davos. These are not coincidences, they are subtle relaunches. The costume may have changed, but the fundamental dance remains familiar. And what of the church? The Orsini and Colonna families once clashed with swords over papal influence. Now, some descendants serve as lay advisors, quietly sitting on councils that possess greater reach than that of an average bishop. They rarely speak, they rarely need to. As previously explored, the Jesuits and other religious orders were frequently utilized as diplomatic arms for noble families. Today, A similar mechanism persists, though filtered through a humanitarian brand. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta, to cite one example, still maintains diplomatic status with both the Holy See and the United Nations. Their events attract cardinals, bankers, and indeed counts and duchesses, often in plain sight. Even the physical geography offers telling clues. Across Europe, numerous noble estates have been converted into luxury retreats, event venues, or museums. Yet, upon closer inspection, one finds that many remain privately owned, still host family events requiring no press release, and are protected by trusts so intricately layered that tracing them would bring a forensic accountant to despair. Then there are the peculiar overlaps. A Borromeo co-owns an art logistics firm that meticulously handles priceless pieces for the Vatican. A Chigi is photographed at a Bilderberg gathering. A modern Orsini's foundation funds climate research through a hedge fund domiciled in a Swiss canton that offers zero public disclosure. All of it legal, all of it unremarkable, unless one is tracing patterns rather than merely scanning headlines. And this is where the intricate web begins to crystallize, the discernible network. Not a definitive smoking gun, not a parchment sealed in blood, but a constellation of enduring influence. Marriages, land holdings, advisory roles, institutional chairs, historic titles, subtly attached to modern mechanisms, sufficient dots to delineate a shape, enough visibility to suggest the pervasive shadow. Certainly, many of these connections are benign. Many of these families are genuinely engaged in philanthropy, cultural preservation, or finance without any sinister intent. However, herein lies the critical point. Power does not need to be sinister to be profoundly real. It simply needs to be enduring. And the most enduring power of all is the kind that no longer requires public announcement. So, if one ever finds oneself strolling through Rome and hears a name Chigi, Colonna, Borghese carved into a fountain, etched on a plaque, or whispered by a tour guide without much context, one should understand this. The story is not over. It is merely playing quieter music, now softer perhaps, but no less meticulously orchestrated. One has followed the web. One has observed the names. One has sensed the pattern. And now, with the final reflections, one might contemplate the only question that truly matters. If they still subtly exert influence, what does that imply for the rest of society? So, here we arrive at the culmination. The ambient lights have dimmed, the clamor of empires, revolutions, and ancient rituals has faded. All that remains is the profound hush that follows a narrative recounted in whispers. One has journeyed alongside names, often overlooked, traversing the opulent palaces of Venice, the labyrinthine catacombs of Rome, the austere banking halls of Zurich, and the conference rooms where the curtains never quite ascend to full transparency. And now, the final, unspoken question hangs heavy in the air. Do they still subtly govern us? Perhaps not with traditional scepters, perhaps not through papal bulls or royal decrees. Yet, within the underlying structures of contemporary society, the inherited wealth, the meticulously bound trusts, the discrete influence over institutions that consistently outlast presidents and parliaments, there exists something eerily permanent, an immutable rhythm. Power, after all, is seldom ostentatious. It manifests not as the voice on the public podium, but as the invitation list to the exclusive private gathering that follows. It is not embodied in the crown itself, but in the land deed secured by the foundation behind it. Not in the sensational headlines, but in the boardrooms that those headlines never feature. Ultimately, whether the Black Nobility remains an active governing force, or merely a legend woven from historical coincidence, their persistent narrative serves as a reminder of a truth both uncomfortable and profoundly human. Those who have wielded power rarely relinquish it entirely. They simply adapt their attire, alter their titles, vanish from the public balcony, and assume a seat behind the curtain. And we, the observers, continue to fixate upon the stage.